Australia, and we're going to have some conversations and yarns with them, presentations, moving forward. Because we want to develop our land, but we want to do it in a responsible way, in a sustainable way, and we can do it. And it just may take a little bit longer, it may take a little bit more work, it may take a little bit more brain power, but you can do it, and we need to do it when you think about it. And do you guys know about the Brewarrina fish traps? Everybody's looking very... You didn't think this was interactive, did you? No? No. Do you know about the Brewarrina fish traps? No. They're 40,000 plus years old. They're in Brewarrina, New South Wales. So as Australians, you have a responsibility to look after our culture and our sites, because our culture and our sites is also your culture and sites. We need to protect them for humanity, not only Australians itself. And they've been working for 40,000 years. That's pretty mind-blowing, isn't it? It's the oldest human construction known construction in the world today. And the aquaculture and engineering, when you think about it. Also, there's this another thing. Aboriginal people did trade up the top for many 400 to 500 years, at least going back. And I made this point the other day to the Chinese ambassador and the consuls up at the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between the two countries. But actually, I pointed out our relations actually go back a lot further, because up the top, sea cucumbers were production plants up there, negotiated with Aboriginal people. So they would have been around a table, but it would have been around a circle, but it would have been around a fire. It would have been sharing stories, sharing yarn, sharing culture, and sharing tucker. So I actually was lucky to meet one of the guys who put the actual exhibition in Melbourne a few years ago down there. So for 400 or 500 years, we did trade with Asia, the Macassans, and Indonesia. So I pointed that out, but also China too. The trade was up through China. And an example of how far we traded back, you can have a look at Vatican hunting bird manuscript. Vatican hunting bird manuscript. And you'll see a very familiar face in there, a very familiar bird. A cockatoo. It goes back to 1241. 1241, that's almost 800 years. So obviously there was interaction. So as Australians, we should be proud of that. And I think we should use that and think about that in our relationships with the world. It's also important we just take a moment's silence to pay respects to our ancestors. We're all going to become part of the ancestors and Mother Earth, return to her. And it's also important that we pay respects for those we've lost the last few years. Remember, they're not just numbers. They're people with faces, people with names, people who are part of families and part of communities, and they had their own dreams and aspirations and lives that they've lived. So we need to pay respects to that. We need to pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owners, elders and custodians of past, present and future. And a moment to reflect your journey right here, right now, at this point in the continuum, and how we can do better for ourselves and our communities and our families. I think so important. And also to centre ourselves, because we have been having very interesting times and we're still moving through those interesting times. So if we just have a moment's silence and a moment of reflection, thank you. We have 3 beautiful waterways, Hawkesbury, Georges and Nepean. These are the aquatic boundaries of our nation. To any of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters in person here or online, we warmly welcome you from country, clan, tribe and nation you come from. And to all our brothers and sisters, we all belong to that one mob, one tribe humanity. On behalf of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, we welcome you here today. That's from our members, our board and our elders. Please have a safe stay, a safe journey home to your family and loved ones and community. And we can achieve great things when we all work for it. You know, we do have to have some truth-telling and some interesting conversations moving forward if we're going to be a great nation and set an example for the rest of the world. We need to understand that diversity and inclusion is so important, and we can talk with our neighbours, we can talk with our colleagues to learn and understand cultures from around the world and the world itself. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded. And remember, none of us are perfect. We will make mistakes, but we need to learn from them. If you do think you are perfect, I think you should seek out a counsellor as soon as possible. I've just finished a diploma of counselling, so please don't see me. You're probably going to be a handful. We need a bit of a laugh from the times we're going through. So please have a great festive season coming up. Spend that time with your family. Do take the time for self-care. As I said, we're going through very interesting times. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Michael, and thank you so much for threading through some of your knowledge and perspectives to the conversations and topics that we're going to be addressing today. Anyone who's been up in the northern part of Australia and sat down with people that, who speak Yolngu, you will know that migration is something that has long been a part of this country, because the language obviously includes words from other countries in nearby regions. So it is a really fascinating thing to gain a perspective on. For all of us who've been welcomed into this country, I would also like to acknowledge the generosity of elders like Michael in sharing their traditions and culture with us, to help us to understand the connection with country and to truly be a part of this nation. So as we reflect on migration, I think that's an important perspective to be thinking about also. So thank you very much, Michael. Can I kind of now move to the drier business of the day, if I could put it that way? It is great to have you here. We've got a jam-packed agenda. We couldn't do this sort of work, we couldn't put these sorts of conferences on without the support of our members, and in particular the support of our generous sponsors. So I would very much like to thank our major sponsors, Fragaman. They have been tremendous supporters of CEDA, particularly in this area of work, not just in these types of conferences, but also bringing their experience and expertise and insights to help us shape our own work and the submissions that we put to government, which is helping us to have greater influence and voice on behalf of all of our members. We've got some corporate tables here, including Serco. Thank you, also tremendous supporters of CEDA. Ming Long, one of our CEDA board directors, who you will see on stage, but also chair of the Diversity Council of Australia. So a good sort of cross-section of people who are helping us to do what we're trying to do here at CEDA. Media in the room today, lots of interest in this area, so good to have them with us. For those of you in the room and online, I apologise, I haven't formally welcomed the online audience. We'd love to get you involved in social media and sharing the insights that you're hearing with a wider audience. If you are so inclined, please tag us on Twitter at CEDA_news, and of course the hashtag today is migration. If you want to ask questions, one of the easiest ways to do so, and including if you're online, is through the Pigeonhole app, CEDA.pigeonhole.at, and the password for that is migration. You can enter questions yourself or vote on the questions that others have asked, which helps those of us who are moderating to get a sense of what you really want to hear from our speakers. I said I'm supposed to tell you to turn your phones to silent, but we all know to do that now. If you're in the room and something goes wrong, please follow the CEDA team or the hotel event staff and we'll get you to safety. And with that, I think my next task is to welcome online Martin Parkinson. I'll wait for him to arrive. While we're doing that, I'm going to give you a little bit of backdrop. Minister for Home Affairs Claire O'Neill, of course, announced a review of the migration system at the Jobs and Skills Summit, and we have recently seen the release of the terms of reference for that and the announcement of the team that is overseeing that review. That includes, of course, Dr. Martin Parkinson, who will be one of 3 experts leading that review. Martin will be known to many of you in the room. He's known to me because he used to be my boss way back when, but he is currently Chancellor of Macquarie Uni and will be known to many through the different hats that he wears has worn in the past, as Secretary of the Departments of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Treasury, and was the inaugural Secretary of Climate Change. We're hoping Martin's going to share with us some perspectives on what the review panel is hoping to achieve, and I'm going to slide over here and hopefully... Is he going to be... I'm looking for some sort of nod that he's... We'll wait and see what's... Obviously, we've had a slight delay in getting Martin online. Oh, okay. Martin's just dropped off unexpectedly. I think there's just been an interruption in his connection, so we'll just, if you wouldn't mind just giving it a few minutes, we'll see if we can get him back online. Sorry? He's on the phone now. Oh, okay. All right, that's okay. We're just waiting for Martin to come back online. He's dropped off and had just an internet connection issue, so he is on the phone and will be back online. I can stand up here and wait for him, or I could start talking about the migration work we've done. I could fill space and tell you about all of the wonderful migration submissions that we're doing. I could ask Jared to jump up and tell you about what we're doing with our migration submission. Or I could crack a few jokes if anyone's got some. The last one sounds good. Look. Actually, can I tell you truthfully that the only jokes I'm going to start cracking, if I really try to think about it, are the really bad dad jokes that I get from my husband, which might not really play well for this audience. I can tell you in all seriousness that Jared and the team are in the process of preparing a submission for the migration review. Many of you will be involved in the work that we're doing through our Migration Advisory Committee. But I can put a bit of a plug in to say that there are key areas of work that the team are looking to feed into this review process, and that we're pretty enthusiastic about it. You'll know that we've had some long-running themes around improving the skills matching process of our migration system. Like virtually everyone else in the space, have concerns with how the current list is working in our capabilities in terms of being able to predict the skill needs of the future, and of course have been pushing for what we think are really practical solutions to get migration moving in a way that makes sense. Chief among them, which I'm hoping to be able to put to the Minister later today, is trying to expedite intercompany transfers, which seems like an easy way to try to get movement of people across borders in a sensible way, without sort of disrupting the apple cart too much. Look am I good to go? Woo, here he is. Oh, Martin, It nearly went really pear-shaped because the audience was asking for jokes.
You should have just said Martin Parkinson, there's your joke.
I have already confessed that you and I worked together for a long time ago, but I won't carbon date you or I. How about we start just straight off the bat with perhaps getting you to tell us a little bit about the review. I know you can't say too much because it's early days in terms of anything that might point to conclusions, but I think the audience would be really interested to hear, how you're thinking about it, how the panel's proposing to go about it, and quite frankly, if you look at everything else that's on your plate, maybe why you actually said yes to doing it.
Okay, thanks. Look, let me start off by congratulating CEDA on the timeliness of this event. As you all know, at the Jobs and Skills Summit, which was back in the beginning of September, Minister for Home Affairs Claire O'Neill announced the intention to commission a comprehensive review of the purpose, structure and objectives of the migration system. She subsequently asked me to chair this review alongside my colleagues Dr Joanna Howe and Mr John Azarias. And then the panel, the establishment of the panel was announced Monday of last week. The intention of the review is to inform the development of a new national strategy, which is a working title of A Migration System for Australia's Future. And the idea here is that we're trying to develop a strategy that will ensure the migration system serves our national interests and complements the skills and capabilities of Australian workers. And as such, is entirely consistent with the objectives that were announced at the Jobs and Skills Summit. A key part of what we've got to do is be clear about the objectives of the migration system and use that to guide our approach to future reform. And that means really a focus on enhancing our economic resilience, boosting our productivity, driving economic growth and delivering rising living standards for all Australians, while maintaining public confidence in the integrity of the system. Now, you might ask, why do this now? I think it's fair to say that we're going into a period, or we're in a period, where Australia faces considerable economic challenges and uncertainty. And they're really a response, or they're the outcome of a set of entangled economic, social, strategic challenges and opportunities. And the result is we've got a backdrop to policy making in Australia at the moment that is probably as complex as anything that we've seen since World War II. We've got economic, demographic and social consequences of an ageing population. We've got slowing population growth. We've got weak productivity growth. And all of that's against this backdrop of heightened global uncertainty and the need to secure critical supply chains and enhance national resilience. And I emphasise critical supply chains, not all supply chains. Yet, if you look around where we are today, across the breadth of Australian businesses and geographies, we see firms and industries suffering from skill and worker shortages. The economy's hampered by limited innovation. It's got a narrow industrial base. Now, they're not the prerequisites for economic success or for stability and security. So we really think we've got to go back and look at what role migration can play in a multi-year, multifaceted response to those challenges. And in doing so, we think it's incredibly important that we also consider the issue of social licence. If the community doesn't believe that the migration system's serving their interests and doesn't believe that migrants are treated fairly, then the willingness to have an expansive and open approach to migration, skilled and otherwise, will be eroded over time. So we think we think we're starting from a situation where our current migration system is complex for everybody who wants to navigate it, whether it's the potential migrants, the potential sponsors, or even the bureaucracy and the supporting ecosystem. So it's incredibly complex, it's inflexible, and when you've got 100 visa subclasses, it's pretty hard to see what the strategic rationale is. So in short, the government's view, which is one that I've shared for a long time, is the system no longer fit for purpose. So when Minister O'Neill then approached me about it, I had no hesitation, notwithstanding everything else I'm doing, in agreeing to take on this role. And I think I can speak for Joanna and John in saying they had no hesitation either, because of the centrality of the migration system to our future success. So what might the strategy look like? What we're going to try and do first up is establish the core principles which we can use to guide the migration system over the years ahead. We're going to be driven by the need to create a simpler, more efficient and more equitable migration system that can at the same time enrich the nation in aggregate and deliver rising living standards for all Australians, help build our critical sovereign capabilities, address challenges associated with our ageing population, climate change, and the need to absorb and utilise new technologies, help us sustain and strengthen our international relationships, and help migrants build new and prosperous lives in Australia. Now, as we approach these issues, a clear focus is going to be how we can facilitate migration that contributes to these outcomes, creating new opportunities for Australians, and complements, not substitutes, for the efforts that we need to make on our own domestic skills and training efforts. Now that, in one way you can say, well, that's sort of bleedingly obvious that we should be doing that. But the point of saying that is because if we facilitate migration this way, it will allow us to focus our regulatory efforts on those areas needed to minimise the risk of harm and maximise the risk or the chance of success. And we really think that we need to be bringing a more risk-orientated lens to how we think about this. Now, the Department of Home Affairs has established a task force to support us with the review. It draws on the resources of PMNC, Treasury, DFAT, the New Jobs and Skills Australia, and Boston Consulting Group. And that task force is helping us with a research program, with consultations with employers and unions, business groups, academia, civil society, migrant communities, state and territory governments. And we'll also be looking at what like-minded partners internationally are doing, and we'll be trying to bring a whole-of-government perspective to this, so we'll be drawing right across the Commonwealth Government. As you said, Mel, we've only just started. As I said, we were announced Monday of last week. We were working for a couple of days before the announcement, and our first product is the discussion paper, which is up on the Department of Home Affairs website. Now, there will be later today a hot button, so you'll be just able to go straight in and you'll have the terms of reference and the discussion paper there. But if you think it's going to be such a riveting read that you can't wait till the hot button's up, you just go into Home Affairs, into reports and publications, then reviews and inquiries, and then departmental reviews, and it's all sitting there. Now, the discussion paper, as I said, was released yesterday. We're very clear in the discussion paper that we've heard what people have been telling government for years. We've gone back through all of the submissions, the parliamentary reports, work of academics and Grattan and so on. So the really valuable thing for us is not to have people help us yet again define and admire the problem. What we're really looking for is people who can lean into the problem with us and help us find solutions. So the discussion paper is not long. It provides context for where we are today, for where the migration system has come from, and then poses a series of questions which really go to the heart, to our way of thinking, of what we need to do. So, once we've done this, we'll be doing, once the discussion paper's out and people are in a position to feed in inputs, we'll be undertaking a set of targeted consultations, predominantly over late January, early February, but in some cases we'll be starting that before Christmas. And then the intention is that we deliver an interim report to the government by the end of February, and then we're aiming for a final strategy for late March, April. But we do have, we do have flexibility up to the budget on that, but our intention is to try and get it done by late March through to early February. Well, I might just stop there and happy to take any questions.
And I'll say to the audience, if you've got a question and you want to throw it into Pigeonhole, please do so quickly. We've got a few more minutes with Martin. Martin, I mean, obviously, from CEDA's perspective, firstly, more power to your arm. The sort of way in which you've articulated the intent of the review is very consistent, I think, with the perspectives that we would bring to this issue in terms of recognising. I mean, you talked about the period. You sort of said we're in this period now that is more uncertain than at any time since the Second World War. That period, of course, has been a period of tremendous migration. It's delivered massive benefit to Australia. I think we've got two sort of challenges that you've articulated. One, which is the system is broken, and partly because things that have been put in place haven't really done what they should have, and so these other responses have emerged around it with more or less transparency than is desirable in many instances. But we've got this sort of this great economic imperative, but also a really different context, both internally in our domestic economy, where people are certainly enjoying full employment and reflecting on that at a point in time and what that means for migration, but also the long-term challenges that you articulated. We're certainly hearing from our members, as you would be aware, that migration is a real challenge for them. They can't get the skills they need, and that this is interrupting their own investment decision-making and deterring investments that might otherwise happen. So it's really critical. The timeframes are really critical, but you've got a big task before you. Can I ask you one question on risk? And I think we've talked about a risk-based system in the past, and tried to sort of, at various sort of points at different reviews, bring risk into the system a little bit more than perhaps it has been in the past. I think there's a perception that I get from talking to people that Australia is quite risk-averse, that the processes that we have are very, very detailed and convoluted. How are you planning to sort of open that conversation up and think about the risk appetite of the community relative to the risk appetite of business?
So I think there are multiple dimensions to risk. One which we've got to be really conscious of, because it goes to what sort of nation we are, is the risk that we expose potential migrants to. So, there is undoubtedly extensive evidence of forms of exploitation. Now, are we a society that is prepared to bring people in, have a almost permanent underclass of people who get exploited? I don't believe we are, and I'm sure that my two fellow reviewers don't believe that's right. So we will be looking at risk exposures that migrants themselves face. We will be looking also at issues of macro level risk in terms of the complexity of the system. It is undoubtedly an opportunity here to look at what are the processes and systems that the department uses in making assessments against criteria about who should be given migrant status. We think that there are real opportunities to improve that process, to streamline it. In doing so, it will make it hopefully simpler for all participants, so potential migrants, their sponsors in the cases of sponsored migrants, but also give the community more confidence. If it's incredibly bureaucratic and paper-based, which it appears to be at the moment, then you get this gigantic ecosystem grow up of migration agents and migration lawyers who add additional cost to the pathway for the people ultimately paying the bills without actually really gaining anything from a economic growth potential. All they're doing is they're taking onto themselves the task of managing the complexity in the system, which then leads you to ask, well, does the system need to be that complex? We will be looking at that as we go through this. I don't want to prejudge the outcome, but I think in this case, we would probably all start from presumption that there are benefits from streamlining, and the question is what form that streamlining might be able to take.
Yeah, I think you would have a lot of support from this audience for that and for some pragmatic steps. We've certainly had put our views, on that to various reviews over the years as well. I knew we were going to run out of time. We knew also that there wasn't. You couldn't go into a lot of detail about the specifics of where the review is going at this stage, but if I can sort of summarise, if you like. Very serious strategic look at setting up a new approach that's going to be principles and objectives driven with much more simplicity at its core, looking for our members and others to be bringing to you not rehashes of things that have been put forward for the last decade or so, take that as known, but looking for new ideas and insights and solutions that can be implemented towards the objectives that you will articulate. So that's the basis on which the review is going forward. The timelines are super tight. We would love nothing more than to end what we call the revolving door of migration reviews, which seem to chop and change faster than just about any other policy. So good luck. Can I just say, as a final comment, Martin, that we think this is a critical issue for Australia's future economic and social development. It is one of the areas where you get that intersect of tremendous economic opportunity. It is going to be a really critical driver of our future growth and productivity, no doubt about it. But as you said, social licence is key. Social cohesion and community acceptance and support for the program is essential. Without that, that, in my view, is one of the factors that has really contributed to this chop and change in policy all the time. So real clarity about what the program is delivering and its relationship to national prosperity is really critical. We are happy to do whatever we can to support the review. So if we can chair anything or pull people together or facilitate anything for you and the panel at any stage, please don't hesitate. And of course, feel free to drop into any of the conversations this afternoon.
Thanks, Melinda. I really appreciate that offer, and I just encourage everybody in the audience to grab hold of the discussion paper and see if they can help make our job a little easier.
Great.
And apologise again for the tight deadlines, but 15 December we need submissions by, given the tightness of.
At least that my team will be glad that it's at least pre-Christmas.
Yes, and can I just say, look, I'm lucky enough, having been asked to chair this, to have two wonderful colleagues who have huge expertise in Joanna Howe and John Azaris, and a great secretariat led by Alison Larkins, who many of the people in the audience would know from her roles in the space. So,
Great.
So get your thinking caps on, folks, and give us the wisdom that you have stored up there. And thanks for having me, Melinda.
Well, and when you're ready to launch the review, you've got an open stage.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Martin. So it's my pleasure now to invite CEDA's Chief Economist, Jared Ball, to the stage, who's going to manage the next session. Thanks, Jared.
Good morning, everyone. Melinda, you've left your glasses here. You might need those.
You put them on if you like.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Jared Ball. I'm the Chief Economist at CEDA, and it's my pleasure to be hosting the session now, keynote on lessons from Canada. Martin's already mentioned that they will be looking to like-minded partners internationally. And Canada, of course, is a country that we look to frequently as a resource-rich federation for policy comparisons. And certainly since the pandemic, a lot of our focuses on those comparisons have been around migration. Canada really got on the front foot in terms of setting quite ambitious permanent migration targets and met them. Canadians have also not been shy in having a conversation about the size of the migration program that they want and the population that they want. And one of the leading voices in that debate has been the Century Initiative, which has a mission to grow Canada's population to 100 million by 2100. And to put that in perspective, the current population is just a tick over 39 million. We're very fortunate to have the Century Initiative's CEO, Lisa Lalonde, with us today. And hopefully she is going to join me on the screen. She is there. You don't have to withstand any jokes from me. Lisa, fantastic to have you with us. Welcome to Sydney virtually.
Thank you. I didn't realize the screen is so monstrous. So great.
Yes, that is the benefit of having a one-on-one conversation, that you are quite prominent in the room. So wanted to just start off with, tell us a bit more about the mission of the Century Initiative, and I guess why 100 million? What's the magic around that number?
Sure. And actually, before I dive in, I just wanted to say that Australia holds a very near and dear place in my heart. I actually traveled there in my 20s when I was leaving the financial services sector, and it actually led me on the path that ultimately led me to Century Initiative. So I'm a great admirer of your country, and I'm very happy to be here. So thank you so much for having me. So Century Initiative, when I was thinking about this question, because often when I talk, I usually get a lot of eyebrow raising of, 100 million, are you crazy? Is usually the first response that I get. And so I think it's important for me to kind of just quickly share sort of, what we are as an organization, why population growth was identified as a key part of our mission, the driver of our mission, and then why 100 million by 2100. So we are a national charity, a national nonpartisan charity. We were founded in 2015, primarily by prominent members of the business community. And I would say that we are unique not only in Canada, but around the world. So there are no other organizations like ours who are actively advocating for population growth with immigration as a driver of that growth. And so the founders created Century Initiative because they recognize that the size of our population is directly linked to our long-term prosperity. We, like Australia, have some significant demographic shifts that are underway in the country. We have an aging population. When I'm talking about it, I say we're a nation of old people. We have a really low birth rate. And it actually, through the pandemic, our birth rate was at the lowest level in 100 years. And our workforce is shrinking. We have significant labor shortages in the country. We, in fact, have hospitals closing their emergency rooms because we don't have the staff to work in the emergency rooms and the ERs. And we're feeling this sort of significant pressure right across multiple industries in the country. So whether it's mining, manufacturing, accommodation and food services, and we have looming shortages in areas like STEM workers. We don't have enough STEM workers. And so there's significant issues that we face as a nation. And so if these trends continue, there was a recognition that we will not have the workforce nor the tax base to be able to pay or support the high quality services that we rely on as Canadians, that we hold near and dear. Our globally ranked education system, our healthcare system, our social services, our social safety net. So we have a choice as a nation. We have to recognize that we can manage our growth or we can manage our decline. And so as an organization, we advocate and we educate Canadians on the demographic shifts underway, why they matter to them, why we need population growth specifically, and also why immigration is the most reliable way to achieve population growth. Because if we have a growing population, we will have the resources necessary to maintain a high quality of life and standard of living for Canadians who are here, but also those who want to join us. And so that's one of the reasons why population growth. The other important one is that the world is changing and that democracy is potentially at risk. And so a nation that is bigger, that is bolder, that has a big ambition is a country that actually can defend its economic interests, its security, its national security interests, its environmental interests. And we can also, as a big nation, be a counter to the growing forces of nationalism and populism that we're seeing around the world. We can also have a greater sense of protection of and maybe independence of our social and economic destiny. And so for these reasons, we focus on population growth. And we picked 100 million as a provocation because it allows me, and perhaps is a reason why I'm here speaking to you. It gets people's attention, and it's a way. It's not just a number. It's been designed as a vision for what the country could be, what it should be, what we want it to be in the future. So it's an aspirational target, and it's a way for us as a country to be able to have conversations that allow us to rise above political short-termism and really focus on the thinking, the planning, and the investments that are needed to support long-term well-being.
So Lisa, you've just touched there on the point of long-term well-being, and I'm not sure if you were listening into the session before, but Martin Parkinson, who's leading our migration policy review, mentioned the issue of social licence. There's obviously a series of complementary kind of policies and strategies around supporting population growth. What do you see as being essential in that regard? And I guess just blending in a question that we've already had on Pigeonhole around what is the mood of the community in Canada around a sustainable population strategy.
So one thing that we're very proud of is this Canadian exceptionalism when it comes to immigration. Canadians overall support immigration. They understand its connection to our economic prosperity. In fact, we actually, Centre Initiative funds an annual public sentiment survey on Canadian opinion on immigration and refugees. It's released every September. We just went through one. And so we were really curious, given sort of rising global unrest and economic insecurity. We have serious issues as we're experiencing, and other countries are experiencing around the world around, rising costs of living, housing inaffordability. So we were concerned or curious as to how things were going to shift or if they were going to shift. And so we were really, really pleased to see that despite these things, that support for immigration in Canada actually grew in 2022. So the mood is great. Although, some of the pieces that I've done more recently, I've been sort of raising my hand saying, this is great. We have great support for immigration in Canada, but it's not something that we can take for granted. And because we have these serious economic issues, because young people are in a position where they can't afford to buy a house, and rents are skyrocketing, not only could that deter sort of top talent from, coming to Canada, but it's a huge issue for people who are already living here. And so will that potentially, drive people to say, what, until we get this housing issue under control, we're going to pull back on immigration? And the simple answer is no. It's like it will be catastrophic if we do that, because some of the labor shortage works we are experiencing are in construction. We have housing projects that are being deferred or even canceled because we don't have the people to build them. And so the issue is, maintaining a steady drumbeat, consistent drumbeat to Canadians on sort of what's happening, why we need population growth, why immigration is so critical, and reinforcing that as a country, as we have these ambitious immigration policies and these levels, that we need corresponding policies in areas like infrastructure, like housing, complementary policies, so that we can actually accommodate growth. So we are not just about a number, we're about growing well. And growing well means having responsible growth, growth that is sustainable, and growth that benefits everyone who calls Canada home. People here already and people who want to come. And so then the question is, well, then what does prosperity look like? How do you define that? And then what's your goal? What's your target? And so 2 years ago, we actually created a national scorecard on Canada's growth and prosperity. It tracks 38 indicators across 6 different focus areas that we've identified are necessary to work for long-term prosperity. And so the indicators identify where Canada is leading, where we're falling behind, an area that might need attention. And the idea is that it's supposed to paint a broader picture of, are we positioned for growth? Can we accommodate this growth? And if not, we can identify quickly where we're falling behind and where we have to invest in resources. So an organization like Century, we look at that scorecard, we share it actively with government, with other stakeholders, with the business community, and then we also put our resources against areas where we're not doing as well. And so in early days, because prosperity in our agenda is so broad, we really zoned in on less focus on immigration level planning, and really work with the government to ensure that immigration remains a non-partisan issue. So we have that societal license in the country because we've been very, very clear across all party lines that immigration cannot be a partisan issue. And the one politician that attempted to do it in the two rounds ago didn't even get a seat. And that is because the business community, the government, the political parties all recognize that we are completely and 100% reliant on immigration to achieve long-term economic and social prosperity. And we've been very good at sharing that message consistently to the Canadian public. And so that's contributed substantially to what allows us to have that license to be able to have these ambitious immigration levels.
Thanks, Lisa. You're generating plenty of questions on Pigeonhole, and I wasn't imagining that we'd have this many in such a short conversation, but I do want to get to a few of them. There's a question around, obviously, the significant role that provinces have in migration in Canada, and a question around how we should be thinking about that in Australia in terms of the role of our states and territories. Can you just elaborate on that and your views on how that translates perhaps in an Australian context?
Sure. So we have, I'm not sure if Australia experiences the same thing, but we have a lot of newcomers who come to Canada and then they establish themselves in the large city centers, and we have primarily 3 of them. They typically mostly go to Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. And some of our the most significant demographic shifts and the pressures that we're feeling from those are happening in smaller communities outside of these centers. And so the question then is, how could we encourage more people who want to come here to be able to settle in these other communities, and not just settle, but then actually stay? And so Canada has introduced different types of provincial and municipal immigration programs that really put the power in the hands of the local communities and the provinces to be able to identify or match newcomers to the needs of the community. And they have different programs in place to connect the businesses and the communities to the newcomers to aid in the integration process, so that when people come, they'll actually want to stay, and they won't want to pivot back to a major city center. And we always say that, it's pretty simple. People come, newcomers will want to come to a community and stay for the same reasons that, I might want to go to another town and settle there and stay. And they want to be able to feel supported. They want to have a good education system. They want to feel that there's a cultural connection. So basically, what we try to do now is really promote or better understand the provinces that are having greater success with their provincial and municipal programs, and then learn from those and adapt from those. And part of Century's work is we're actually supporting some academic studies with some universities in Canada. And I believe there's actually an Australian university partner as part of this to look at attraction and retention of immigration in rural communities. And so our goal is to then translate that into accessible insights that policymakers can actually use to inform their activities and planning.
And Lisa, you mentioned the point of skill shortages, which we can all relate to in this room, particularly in the areas that you mentioned. There's a question here about your views on the composition of the migration program in Canada around skilled, unskilled, and I guess also the source countries. And I think we all have this sense that we're increasingly going to be competing for the same talent with ageing populations. What's the thinking on that?
Well, so Century Initiative hasn't really taken a position on the percentages within the categories, the classes. I believe ours is very similar to Australia's. We've been actively promoting the economic class, I think when it comes to the skilled trades issue, I think there's one distinction. I'm not as familiar with the Australian system, but there's one distinction where there's greater alignment with the immigration selection process and the skills shortages that are needed. So we've been actually having some conversations more recently about how can our education systems, for example, that attract international students, how can they better align with our immigration policy? So how can these education strategies align with immigration policies so that we can actually address the specific shortages that we have now and the ones that are coming? So we are not, I would say, as good at doing that, and there's a lot of pressure, particularly from the business community, because we have such significant issues. The other piece is we have probably not dissimilar to Australia. We have regulations and institutions that make it really difficult for people to actually work in the fields that they've been trained in once they come here. And so we know that through COVID, we had provinces and colleges pivot in order to address the significant healthcare shortages that we had during the peak of COVID. And so we know that we can shift when we need to. We know what needs to be done. And so it's just about how do we crack that nut with the provinces. I don't think we're there yet. We haven't totally figured it out, but we have an example now of what we did during COVID, and how can we then apply that more broadly?
Thank you. Final question before we go to the next conversation, and I guess just to bring us all the way back around, you've talked about some of the exemplary elements of the migration system in Canada from your view, including the non-partisan nature, the role of provinces. A lot of people in this room who have important roles in the migration system. Interested in your advice to everyone here in terms of how we kind of shift and navigate a conversation that gets us to the kind of migration system that we want in the future, particularly as we're embarking on a government review.
Right. Well, I mean, one piece too that I wanted to mention, building off the last question, and then I'll jump back to this one. You talked about the increasing competition for talent. And so as we're looking at our system, as we're actually trying to strengthen it so that we can actually attract and retain talent, there are countries like the US, like the UK, that are actively, we are, like Australia, we're experiencing a massive backlog, administrative backlog, which undermines our reputation. And puts our process at risk. And the question that we've been raising to government is: are we losing the next narwhal because we have these administrative backlogs? And we need to act now in order to address those, because there are countries like the UK. The US, they were in the process of modernizing their immigration system to include more funding for visa processing. We've got the UK that launched their aggressive campaign. And so when we look at enhancing ours, it's how do we make sure that we continue to be competitive in this landscape? Although we're a great country and people know that we have this societal license, and that gives newcomers a sense of confidence that they can settle here and the political environment won't shift to the same degree as another country. But you've got countries like China and India, those are two target source countries for Canada, that have introduced incentives to lure people back, with China having a greater degree of success in doing so. So what are those incentives, and how can we match those and have a greater sense of how we can compete? The other question that we've raised is, we think we have a great brand in Canada, but do people actually think of Canada as a target? We know what our target source countries are, going back to an earlier question. Is this going to change? Do people actually want to come here? And do we have the data to actually help us understand, and then also how that can inform policy? So in terms of maintaining the social license, one of the advantages that Century Initiative offers the government in particular is that we are not funded by the government. We weren't established by the government. We are independently funded, and we are a charity. And so we can actually provide that consistent drumbeat to Canadians on why population growth is essential to our economic prosperity, why we need immigration. And the key part of this is, when I joined Century, we were really focused on facts, so establishing the facts, talking about the facts. But what we found was the most impactful was connecting Canadians to individual stories of newcomers, and highlighting their contributions to Canadian society, both their economic ones and their social and cultural ones. One of the big, when we talk about looking at the impacts of immigration to inform policy, some of the standard measures are economic measures, GDP per capita, productivity, wages, public finances, etc. But there are medium to long-term impacts of immigration that aren't captured well. So, for example, second-generation impacts. So we have, for example, the Canadian CEO bank, the president and CEO of one of the top 5 banks in Canada. His parents were actually refugees, and now he's head of one of the largest banks in the country. We have the first female CEO of a bank in Canada who is herself an immigrant. And so can we talk about these stories? Can we share these stories and these impacts? And we're finding that's resonating with Canadians. It's making a difference.
Lisa, I'm not sure if you're doing this knowingly, but you're giving a great segue into our next conversation, which is on the migrant experience. Out of that last answer, I really took 3 things: confidence, certainty, and administrative efficiency. And I think we'll probably hear a little bit more on the last point later this afternoon from our immigration minister in terms of the administrative backlog. Can I thank you for early evening there, I think, in Canada. Can I thank you on behalf of everyone here for joining us today?
Thank you so much. There's so much more to talk about, and I'm sorry I don't have more time, but thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to share a little bit about it.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's now my great pleasure to welcome CEDA Director Ming Long to the stage for our conversation on migrant experience.
This session is about migrant experience. I'm just inviting Di up straight away because I don't want to lose any time with her. But really, you know, our nation has been built on migration, and I think it is time to re-examine their experience in this country, because we make assumptions that it is fair, and we make assumptions that, you know, they just thrive in Australia just automatically. But there are systems in place that certainly make it more difficult for them. You have the pigeonhole, hopefully online. Love to get your questions, otherwise I'm just going to get mine in. But Di, if I can just start with you, I don't think I need to introduce you. Everyone should know you by now. You've been a journalist, you've been a Liberal Party member, a candidate for your electorate. You've then ran against a Liberal member for the Fairfield Council, so they kicked you out, became an independent. You had cancer and beat it. Then you ran against a big name Liberal candidate for your electorate as well, and you beat her. Do we underestimate refugees?
I think probably you do. Oh, not you, but I think people do underestimate.
We do, right.
I think it's about. I think it's actually I stood against a Labor candidate, not a Liberal candidate.
Labor?
Yes, Labor. A former Premier of New South Wales, and I think that Australian society generally do embrace migrants and refugees, and I suppose my story and my family stories is one of those stories. It looks success it's not overnight success. It's about decades of integration work or trying to integrate into the Australian society, and we did that when we first arrived. You know, I was just saying to the driver, I couldn't speak English, and I'm sometimes surprised that here I am, a member of Parliament, and can speak English. I know I still have an accent every now and then because English is my second language. I used to be very fearful and ashamed that I've got an accent, but now I embrace the fact that it is who I am, and it's one of the greatest things about being an Australian is that we're now, I think today, more than ever, embracing people of diverse background in our workplace. But in particular, I think we're seeing a bit of that emerging through the leadership space. And I think Ming, you know how passionate I've been over the last decade in terms of driving that conversation around diversity in leadership. And I think that, so for refugees, it's, Australia, embrace us, but then don't think more about beyond, well, they've integrated, they've settled well, it's all good now. They've gone to work and whatever they do within their community. But I think maybe they don't, or especially the leadership across Australian society probably do not see the value or have not tapped into the value of migrants or refugees at the leadership level. Mm-hmm. But I think we've seen that changing a little bit in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Not without efforts from parties like you. You know, in terms of, we've talked in the past around having more of the migrants or certainly the culturally and racially marginalised people in leadership positions. Do you think our citizens in our country understand that we need to embrace difference, right? That, if do we expect migrants just to be more like us and there's nothing that we need to do to ourselves? But I sense if we do that, we're losing the best part of being a migrant or refugee, right? Because I love the fact that when you did your speech in Parliament, the picture I think everyone saw was the fusion, and that is Australia.
Yeah.
So do you think we understand enough that we ourselves actually also need to change to embrace that difference? Because my sense is that
I
that
think,
difference becomes a risk sometimes.
Yeah, look, I think that obviously I'm being generalised here, that for English speaking or if I can use the term Anglo-Celtic, Anglo-Australian thing, embracing it's great for refugees and migrants to settle, to be part of the community, but I think there isn't, from my perspective, a view that they can somehow be part of. Maybe it's an unconscious thing, that they're not part of that leadership or decision-making at the decision-making level. And it's very unconscious, I believe. Maybe some are conscious, but a majority of the time in the work that I've done the last few years is very unconscious, the unconscious bias, as we say. And I think it's a two-way street as well, because people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, such as myself, you kind of question, are you able to be part of that leadership circle? Are you good enough? Me with my accent, me with my refugee background, do I have, I'm educated here, I'm tertiary educated, but you still don't feel that you are good enough to be to contribute to that leadership conversation, and therefore there isn't that pool there of talent. There is, but there isn't a conscious pool to say, hang on, we actually can contribute. We actually have got something to offer. We can bring our real experience, our lived experience to the decision-making process. For instance, last week at the part of the amendment to legislation around respect at work bill for the Human Rights Commission, in terms of the positivity push that's being expected of companies and organisations, I made a small amendment, I thought, a very small amendment, which was to ensure that whatever the information that's coming out of that legislation had to target culturally and linguistically diverse Australians as well, and that to make those material available in languages in that bill, and unanimously supported by both the government and by opposition. And I was told by Bob Catter, who's the father of the house, to say, that doesn't happen often, that for somebody who's been there only for 6 months, to get that push that changes through. So while it's small, it actually will have an impact, because Kate Jenkins came to see me and said, you don't realise how important that amendment was. Now, if you hadn't come from that culturally and linguistically diverse background, you would not have been able to suggest that amendment, because you would not have had that experience of what it means, that community, to ensure that you engage with that community in a way that they can understand and they can get. So I think we've seen, from my perspective, and I can proudly say I was part of that drive to encourage people of backgrounds like myself to actually put themselves forward and lean in, as was famously said, to say, I can actually take a lead, I can actually make decisions, and I want to be part of that. And so that movement has started. And so the next stage now is for the leadership of Australians, corporations, organisations, leadership, politics as well, to start seeing, hang on, they're just not migrants and refugees of Australians of migrant and refugee background, but they're actually new Australians who've got perspectives, who've got lived experiences, who can actually bring that to the decision-making table. So I think that will be probably the next stage in terms of Australia embracing that whole cultural diversity into at that leadership level.
I love that. I mean, the amendment that was put through really goes to the heart of power dynamics that sit with some migrants in the country. We've had Martin Parkinson come on before and talk about the fact that there are migrants who can get to this country, or refugee, however you get here, there's exploitation potential or risk of exploitation because the power dynamics that don't necessarily work in their favour. You and I have talked a long time about bamboo ceiling, right? And I know there feels like an Asian context to that, but I know that you haven't really just thought about it in that Asian context. We're talking about culturally, you've talked about it as culturally, linguistically diverse. I talk about it as culturally and racially marginalised because not every migrant's racially marginalised. If we claim to be a successful multicultural society in Australia, and the bamboo ceiling exists in this country, what do we actually need to do to actually ensure that that ceiling for those culturally, linguistically diverse or racially marginalised people can rise beyond that ceiling?
So I have this saying that if a door is closed, you either kick it down or you build another door. So absolutely there are ceilings and there are barriers for gender, for women of diverse background, or for people with disability as well. So there's always barriers. I think I have really come to realise in my old age that there are plenty of barriers, and sometimes your personal barriers as well. I think that's one of the greatest things, is your own personal barrier, and that was my and through pushing and having that conversation around pushing through that bamboo and glass ceiling for me, I've come to realise that in engaging with so many hundreds of people over the last 10 years in the space that I was pushing around diversity, I realised that there are as much personal barriers as much as there are systematic barriers. So, and therefore for me, at the end of the day, it comes down to the individual, and for myself is how do I challenge myself and break through some of those barriers. And I suppose, the federal election was one of those barriers that I thought, can I do it? Because it was, run as an independent. I was up against a machinery, and a very high-profile woman. And I thought, what have I got to lose? I've survived a boat journey. I survived that. And I've survived breast cancer. And I thought, really, this is just another campaign. Of course, we have to survive. My husband saying, well, this is a bigger mortgage now. You have to take out of, money from our mortgage. That's the thing we have to survive. But he survived my political journeys and, taking money from our mortgage to campaign. And so this time we thought, we'll just another big chunk, of money, but we'll give it a go. And actually that was really, I think, satisfying for me because I believed in what I was doing. The community believed in me, and that I'm really proud and humbled to be sitting in the Parliament. Out of the 151 members of Parliament, and there's been 1,240 members of Parliament elected since Federation. So I'm so honoured and privileged to be one of those. But out of the 151 elected in 2022, I'm the only independent in there that was not supported by any major groups, definitely not by major parties, but it was my own money, or my family's own money. The community donated about, from across the country really, about 80,000. So in total we spent $161,000 on that campaign. Versus when I don't know if you saw the release recently of AEC of all of the independents who spent over $1 million to win the seat. I thought, wow, so the community really delivered it. And that community where 70% of the population were born either overseas or both parents born overseas, and the majority of the population were refugees and migrants. So I just feel, I can't express enough how humble I feel that was given to me. But yeah, so I think create your own opportunities. Sometimes you say seize the opportunities, right? But if the opportunities aren't there, you create it. So I often create opportunities as well, as much as seize opportunities. So yeah.
Such a great story. If I can now invite my virtual panellists on, So we also have for the ongoing panel, we've got, here we go, there's Lorraine Finlay from the Australian Human Rights Commission, is a Human Rights Commissioner, and Violet Rumilatis, the CEO of Settlement Services International. But this is sort of a great segue into a question I want to ask Violet, because you talk so easily about, you know, didn't have this massive war chest to win that electorate, but there are decades of commitment that you made to that community, which I think that people underestimate it. Violet, if I can come to you first. We've just heard Di's story. Do we have a view in this country that refugees are flawed, like we are here as a country, we're so good, we are saving them? Do we understand the unique strengths that migrants or refugees actually bring to our country versus the status quo that exists?
Thanks, Ming, and thank you, Di. It was wonderful listening to your story. You are certainly inspirational and a role model to all of us. And we're very proud of your achievements. Look, I think that we do have a tendency in this country to approach migrants from a deficit basis, definitely. We're looking at gaps and we look at vulnerabilities rather than acknowledging the strengths and the resilience that they bring to Australia. And we tend to see one side of the ledger only, the cost, but not actually the great economic, social and cultural contributions. But I think we are getting better at harnessing those strengths and recognising them. And this is why migrant services, organisations like mine and many hundreds and thousands across the country really focus on looking at giving people a hand up, not a handout. Because when people come, it really is about, they come on various visas as newcomers and they need particular support to actually activate all the strengths that they have. Because we know people come, they may come with trauma if they're refugees, but they come with many strengths as well. And I think settlement support over the last few years has really focused on enabling independence and recognising often it's lacking, what's lacking for new migrants is really the contribution to contribute, the networks that they need, the work experience, understanding the local work market, and what else is available to help them sort of build their new life in Australia, such as, of course, learning English, etc. I think in terms of cultural recognition too, there is a recognition of strengths of migrants, and I think that we are a multicultural country. We're really a foundational part of our heritage. And what was really encouraging for me was more recently the Scanlon, annual Scanlon report that actually said that, and the agreement with the proposition that multiculturalism has been good for Australia was at 80% in 2019 and is 86% in July 2021. So that shows a very positive growth. And then the proposition that immigrants are generally good for Australia's economy was endorsed by 76% of people in 2019 and 86% in July 2021. And lastly, the question that someone was born outside of Australia was just as likely to be a good citizen as someone born in Australia. Agreement was 90% in 2020 and 92% in 2021. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So I think that's something that we can be proud of, very much so.
Yeah, thanks, Violet. I mean, it's probably taken a long time to get there, but maybe it's also because you're recognising, because there's a shortage of skills in Australia at the moment, the importance of migrants in this country. Just to stay with you for a minute, if I can, Violet, and then I'll come to you, Lorraine, in similar sort of question. You know, in financial services, there's a term called VUCA, right? It's an acronym. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Do you think migrants and refugees have just that inherent skill, because they've had to learn it, to be able to deal with VUCA, to deal with volatility? You know, things are uncertain, things are complex through our migration system, and things are ambiguous in terms of, you know, their ability to thrive in this country?
Well, I mean, anyone who has to navigate our migration system to get a visa and to arrive has to be very agile and very resilient. And really, that pre-arrival process is extraordinary, the amount of work that goes into that and planning. And once people arrive, irrelevant of their visa type, again, very skilled, humanitarian, refugee, family, they come with aspiration, they come with their family and a want to lay roots and to build a life in Australia. And that means that they will come with a mindset that is really around openness, acceptance. You know that many who arrive in the first 4 years are not entitled to any support, income support. They really need to, you know, fall on their own smarts in many ways, and charities and settlement organisations. And of course, this is a policy flaw because it forces many people to arrive and just take any job, whereas it may not be the job that they want or need, or they have skills and qualifications, and they end up, you know, the proverbial driving a taxi or cleaning, and they could be dental hygienists or, you know, solicitors. So there is a long way to go around policy that helps ensure that when people come, all the goodwill that they have, the experience, expertise, you know, and their resources, that it's applied as quickly to them meeting their individual potential. So it's a bespoke approach to each person. I think Australia does it well, and I heard our previous keynote on Canada. We work very closely with our Canadian colleagues. We have a lot in common, but it really is about tapping in. You put the person in the centre, refugee, humanitarian entrant, skilled migrant, temporary migrant, and you work around their needs and you activate what they need. And they have all of those sort of skills and qualifications and goodwill to really make it work.
Yeah, it's sort of inbuilt. Like I said, they've had to learn it just because they're traversing our complex, our systems. Lorraine, if I can come to you, that same term, you're in Geneva at the moment. If you can talk a little bit about why you're there, but I want you to talk about, you know, you wrote a piece in The Guardian regarding encouraging UN scrutiny of conditions in Australian prisons and detention centres. And, you know, there's been a lot of focus on how we treat refugees and asylum seekers through the application process. But also, there are humans in Australia at the moment that have no certainty about what's going to happen to them. Do you want to just talk about migrants coming into this country in that context? Do we have a global reputation problem?
There is a lot to unpack from that, Vin. Thank you so much for starting with an easy question. But it's so, I'm so pleased to be with you this evening. For me, it's just after midnight in Geneva, and I apologise for not being there in person. But why I'm in Geneva is Australia is actually undergoing its 6th periodic review relating to our compliance with the Convention Against Torture. So I'm here to take part in those sessions. And it was really interesting, in the public session earlier today, the Australian delegation made comments on a broad range of issues, but one of the things they did highlight was Australia's generous humanitarian program. So there certainly is a recognition, not only of the contribution that migrants make, but of what a generous humanitarian program says about Australia on the international stage and what our values and character are. So I think that's the first thing that's really important. But the other thing to note in this public session is that the committee is really focusing on immigration settings to do with detention. So they're really looking at primarily, not exclusively, but primarily closed immigration detention in terms of some of the concerns that they've raised. And that's obviously an incredibly important question, because Australia is an outlier when we look at, for example, the fact that the average period of time somebody spends in detention in Australia through our immigration policies is 742 days. And there are 144 people who've been in closed immigration detention for over 5 years. So that's a significant question, but it's also important not to forget it's only part of the story, and that there are actually a really significant number of people who aren't in closed immigration detention, who are in the community, but who still don't have that certainty around their immigration status. And that raises a whole range of questions about how they can actually start to become part of the community and how they can start to build a life, and how we can create that cohesiveness and certainty when we have people who aren't in and aren't out. They're in this transitional phase that is actually going on for quite an extended period of time. And so we're talking about, for example, as of October this year, there were about 31,274 people in the unauthorised maritime arrival legacy caseload. So it's significant numbers of people, and it's important, I think, to think about how we can ensure that the system works effectively but works in a really timely way, so that obviously the checks are done that need to be done. We have the legal framework that we need to have, but we actually recognise that these processes have such a dramatic impact on people's lives. Leaving people in that sort of transition period for an extended period of time is enormously damaging, not only to the individual, but also to the broader community in terms of the risk of entrenching that division and difference that really isn't helpful.
Yeah.
Can I?
No, absolutely. Go, Di.
So just talking, to Lorraine, we in Fowler, we've had about, in the last 5 years, had about 10,000 refugees resettled from the conflict in Iraq and Syria. And that has been a challenge because obviously that has put a lot of pressure on our limited resources, such as our schools, homes, obviously with increased prices in housing and affordability and rent as well. What we've seen in our community is there's been a mushrooming of granny flats, which then has an impact on the environment because obviously, either it's not built properly or even it's built properly, that adds to obviously the environment in terms of when it rains, and that means too many, concretes and all that stuff. So there's a lot of ramifications in terms of when you settle 10,000 refugees, that's almost like a suburb, but we weren't given the infrastructure such as obviously increasing, public transport, schools, our hospital. There's been so much issues that goes along with the resettlement of refugees, and then in addition jobs, because a lot of them, some of them are with family reunification. But then that put a lot of pressure on the families because we get the complaint from the family saying, we can't handle this, we need more homes. And of course, there's a backlog of shortages of social housing or homes as well for our community, let alone for refugees. So I think when we talk about refugee settlement, migration, we need to not do it in isolation of just refugees settlement, but it has to be done in a holistic manner. And I'm speaking from the experience of have to deal with it from a local level, and then of course state level as well as federal level. So I think, and what happens is with immigration is that federal government makes a decision, dumps it on state, and then state dumps it on local. And there's no communication, or there's no dialogues between those three levels of governments, when it's very vital that those communications have to happen in order to provide and plan ahead for the success, set them up for success. Otherwise, we will have, in a few years' time, a community that have not fully integrated, and then there'll be problems, and there'll be unemployment, and there'll be housing shortages, and then there'll be community tension. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, we tend to think of it.
Add one point in
Yeah, go, Lorraine.
Just
Absolutely.
very briefly. We often assume that, when somebody's seeking asylum, that arriving in the country and having that immediate safety is almost the end of the story, when in actual fact, it's really the beginning of the support that you need to provide. And it's really important that we don't forget that for two reasons. The first is obviously setting the individual or the family who have arrived up for success, as Di was saying, which is incredibly important in terms of providing the supports they need to be able to really become part of the community and make the most of the opportunity of being in Australia. But the second reason it's really important is because there are those practical things that come with increasing your population around infrastructure and provision of education and health services and transport and housing, etc. And if we want to have that community support for a strong immigration program, we need to manage those practical issues. So that's why that thinking through those follow-up supports and how we can manage this in a really practical way is critical not only for the individuals, but actually for the overall immigration program and ensuring that community support.
Yeah, such a great comment around having an ecosystem. It's not just a linear, great, you're in the door, off you go, which is sort of Violet, where you sort of, in some respects, have had to step in, but an ecosystem that looks at how we actually get them to thrive in Australia, to be able to get to what Martin was talking about, which is how they enrich our country, to be able to reap that benefit. We stopped at the wrong place.
I think they're still working in silo. We're very much in silo how we work, and having worked in 3 levels and having been that experience in 3 levels of government, I know that they work so much in silo. And I think to break that, there has to be a point whereby those 3 levels of government, the decision makers have to come to the table and say, I bring people in, state, this is what we need to do, local, where can you play a role? At the moment, there isn't that.
It sort of feels like there isn't a combined responsibility. You sort of wash your hands and off you go at the next phase. Violet, can I bring you in? Because I know you want to talk about this piece too, because of what you do in SSI.
Yes, I just wanted to comment. I take Di's point. I think one of the beauties of our migration program, or the humanitarian program, is essentially just short of 14,000 per annum. It was a challenge, of course, when there was the extra cohorts, Syrian Iraqi, and people welcomed that. It was a great opportunity, but of course what came with that was one socioeconomically area that took the great brunt of it, and Fairfield, as we know. The infrastructure was really strained. And I think that one thing that we've learned is that we do need the 3 levels of government to work very closely, but to also involve the community, because that is also the missing link, it's a critical part. And so I must say that in New South Wales, under Peter Shergold as Coordinator General and some new resources, there has been a real desire. There's now a New South Wales settlement plan, which is first for many, many years of its kind, that actually incorporates those 3 levels of government. And I think local government is critical, and also infrastructure. But in terms of coordination, I would say I have the view that I think there is good coordination across from when someone first arrives and over that long-term journey. When people first arrive, there's specialised services to support. And then with time, there really is a push into mainstream services, because that's where the resources are. And people should be able to access those resources fairly. And really, settlement programs are all about equity, about people getting their fair share of the resources that the small S state has to offer. And I think organisations across the country in settlement do that very well in partnership with specialised education, specialised refugee nurses. There's a whole sector that really works well around the person and their needs. Housing is a huge issue, absolutely huge issue. And we really need to think outside the square around how we address those sort of challenges. And with goodwill and some good, resourcing, you could actually really develop some good housing models that don't take away from ordinary Australians that are also struggling. And I know that with us, newly arrived refugees and humanitarian entrants all going to the private market, and it's challenging, but they do okay. They get support and they do manage, but it is a challenge, as we know, housing.
Jobs is also a challenge. When we first came to Australia, my mother, back in those days, I don't know, the Catholic Church helped, and she got a job as a kitchen hand. She got a job cleaning houses. And so I also helped. I remember that, cleaning houses. But I think those who are arriving today, it's very hard to find those menial jobs. And I think those jobs are important for refugees to really build that they're doing something rather than kind of coming in and just relying on their families, whatever, and feeling very, when you arrive here, you already feel kind of out of place. You're in a different culture. You've got back when we arrived, we had no community support. There wasn't a big Vietnamese population, so therefore there was nothing that we can, we were in Wollongong, so there wasn't even a pho restaurant to go to and have our bowl noodle soup, right? And so we had to kind of cook it ourselves, and and so for us, the settlement period took time because we had to learn English, working. But now there's the pros and cons of they've got the community support, but then they don't have that job sort of to go to so that they can break out of that. You know, it's because you can get stuck and you can get depressed because you've got no, you know, you don't feel like you're fulfilled and you feel like productive.
Yep.
So I think that's the problem for a lot of
Because really,
refugees.
they want to contribute.
They want,
company,
yeah,
they
yeah,
want to contribute.
yeah.
It's
because I feel like you know, back in where they came from, they probably ran a business or they had or they were doing some work, and a lot of them professionals. I mean, the Asylum Seeker Research Centre came to us and are trying to, and we put a petition. The independents put through a petition to. I think there's about 3,500 people on temporary visa, and we're trying to get the government to make sure that those people, because they're ready to work. You know, they've been here for 10 years, so we're trying to push that so that they can be part of the community, because you just don't feel like you got to do something.
You want to be integrated. Can I just pick up a thread that I think it was Violet who talked about before around, you know, some of the migrants that come to Australia have professional qualifications from their country of origin.
That's right. Yeah.
That don't necessarily get recognised here.
Yeah.
Right. So then you move into, well, I will do any job because you want to work. It's just
There's
not
a lot of
you want to
doctors,
work. So
yeah.
then you'll take anything.
Yeah.
There's a question in the Pigeonhole app that talks about a migration system. You know, how can the migration system work better to be more inclusive of diverse talent sources such as refugees displaced from overseas, offering more access to alternative pathways, not just humanitarian? But can you weave into that your thoughts around what can we do to ensure that we're recognising their qualifications from overseas?
So there's a lot of people who are either doctors, nurses, engineers, qualified from overseas. So what we're trying to do now so that's the great thing about being in Parliament, is to be able to now advocate to the Minister, and he's aware of that when you have him today. I have spoken to the Minister, Andrew Giles, about that, and we'll probably be speaking with the Home Affairs Minister, whereby their qualification has to be recognised. For instance, with doctors, apparently we have to go through the Royal Australian Doctors, you know, the RAP, that body, because they're the ones that actually will approve or make the decisions as whether or not to recognise the qualification. So there's only certain thing that a politician or a minister can actually do by taking it to those bodies, associations, to say, from even engineering, whatever, to say, a nurse, to say, how can we create a pathway for these individuals who are actually qualified in their birth country, but if we have shortages of nurses or doctors here, how can we tap into them? And that's the conversation that we're having at the moment, and the Asylum Seeker Research Centre is having with us, and we're having with the Minister, and so that's currently taking place.
Can I just, this is a tricky question, but I'll be blunt, so I apologise in advance. Because, you know, having spoken to a lot of Chinese, particularly heritaged Australian citizens in this country, when the whole dialogue about whether we were loyal to this country was on, do you still feel like, as a Member of Parliament, that there is a question about your loyalty to this country? So if we sent you back to Vietnam, would there be a question about who you're representing at that point?
You know that when you run, you have to renounce your Australian citizenship if you have, you were born overseas. Interestingly, though, if you've got a British citizenship, I don't think you have to renounce that. But so with my Vietnamese one, I mean, I was a refugee, and of course, when we escaped, my understanding, because this whole thing, because they were trying to chase me, saying that, I have not renounced my citizenship. And first of all, I thought to myself, hang on, I'm more Australian than as much as you. Like, I don't even know Vietnam because I left when I was so young. I grew up here most of my life. So this is my home. This is my second homeland. So how can you question my loyalty to Australia? And I probably sound very Australian when I speak Vietnamese to my grandmother. My Vietnamese doesn't sound Vietnamese. So that's how Australian I am. And so I went through the process of renouncing my Vietnamese citizenship, lo and behold, the Vietnamese government said, well, you're not a citizen, because I was a refugee. So by becoming a refugee, I was no longer considered a Vietnamese citizen. So that whole thing really, really kind of pissed me off. But I thought, you know what, the process is there. So I went through the process. I did the renounce, and and of course the media at one stage, because the other side trying to knock me off by saying that I was still, did not renounce, because I did not tell them I had renounced. So in the media was chasing me, but then eventually I kind of put the paperwork into so you have to register your paperwork that you've renounced. But it is like you think, I'm so straight. And then when I decided to make my first speech, I wore the Australian flag, and I wore it in my Vietnamese tradition, because that's my heritage. But I am an Australian, and so I celebrated my Australianness by having that Australian flag and wore that, because I wanted to speak to say I am a proud Australian of Vietnamese heritage, and that dress for me said that. And I think we will get there whereby people who are Australian, if you can call it Anglo-Australian, can see that just because I look different, I've got yellow skin, slanted eyes, doesn't mean that I'm not as Australian as those who came here under Captain Cook. And often at many ceremonies, the Indigenous community say, well, we actually have been here much longer than everybody, all of you. So therefore that's whole debate as well, right? But it is. But it's something that I think you and I have to learn to say, it's okay. They might not accept me yet, but doesn't matter. I'll be in their face, and I'm now currently in their face in Parliament. So they have to accept that I'm Australian.
Yeah, I think it's a work in progress.
Yes.
I think we sort of feel like a little bit. You probably have to continually demonstrate that.
I love my
Vegemite.
I love my Vegemite on toast.
That means you get in. Violet, do you want to talk about, the recognition of the professional qualifications as well? Because you have to face into that I mean, you're talking to a lot of the migrants that they're probably astounded that it isn't recognised, especially if they've been working as a doctor, for example, or as a nurse for decades, and it just doesn't get recognised here. How do you actually help those migrants navigate that despair of thinking, my God, you're just not going to recognise something that's so intrinsically what I'm trying to bring to this country?
Yes, thanks, Ming. Look, I'll look at it in two parts. One, refugees, humanitarian entrants, and then others who arrive on skilled, visas, for example. In relation to refugees and humanitarian entrants, I mean, SSI is one of the largest sort of settlement providers, and we have employment programs, and we specialise in working with refugees, humanitarian entrants who recently arrived. And many would know more recently there was a huge tender in terms of our employment services. And the thinking around that, the new tender was a co-design model that was years in the making, where there would be specialisation, recognised, the importance of it. And there were groupings such as, of course, your mainstream, but you had ex-offenders, refugees, culturally and linguistically diverse, First Nations and disability. Now, when the tender played out and all the contracts were announced, in an area like Western Sydney, not one refugee licence was issued to an organisation to run a refugee licensed employment service. It went to mainstream. And when we asked the question, why mainstream? Why to generalist? When you did one specialised model, it was, well, they assured us that they can actually deliver. Now, SSI over the last 4 years has assisted over 3,000 refugees, humanitarian entrants into jobs. And we run a program, it's state funded, and that actually looks at the person as a whole and looks at their career. What is their aspiration in career? So it's not just about the job, it's about the qualification recognition, the bridging courses, work experience, opportunities to go and learn the local work market, improving English, learning the industry language of the industry they want to go into, working with industry groups, architects, engineers, solicitors, and providing opportunities through career seekers and other great organisations doing work. So it's a collaborative, holistic, integrated approach that only organisations that are working with people newly arrived and understand those issues can actually address. And then, of course, with time, people move into their mainstream services. In 5 or 10 years' time, a refugee is a citizen in New South Wales or Victoria or WA. They're living a good life and they'll use the services they need that mainstream Australians will use. But in that initial period, you do need that specialisation. So it is disappointing when resources government has, I think, aren't deployed as effectively as possible. But I also believe state government and territories have a responsibility to understand people are residents in your country. The moment they come, they're going to spend. They're going to pay rent, they're going to pay for school fees, they're going to go to the supermarket and buy what they need. They are contributing immediately, and whatever you invest in people who are resident in your area, you will get back tenfold. So it really is about, I don't even know how to address the issue of, obviously it's qualifications, skills. It's a huge issue. Every state and territory have got their own markers. I know in Canada, our colleagues have got a good system there where people pre-arrival can actually check if they're recognised. If not, they can do courses before they come. They can look at getting jobs. That pre-arrival work is critical. I'll just quickly comment on that in terms of skilled migrants. Pre-arrival is the key. And virtually, it's so easy to engage with people virtually around what is your aspiration, where do you want to live. People know about schools, about accommodation, the cost of rent and jobs and qualifications, and they can actually come informed. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people say, I was told there are many jobs in this area, and they come and they can't find a job, they get very demoralised, they send out 50, 60 applications, and they don't even get an interview. It really is heart-wrenching and demoralising for people. Therefore, they just take any job, and it's just this terrible spiral of lost, capital, lost benefits.
Yeah. Lorraine, can I come to you? Our treatment of migrants and particularly international students through COVID, do you think that's left a mark on our reputation, also internationally? But there's a question in the app that says, should we increase the refugee intake, and how do we build and maintain community support for this?
Well, if I can take that last part of the question first, I think a big part of it is actually highlighting the stories, and that gives you a way to show how refugees are contributing to the community and helping build a better Australia. So I think those positive stories are really important in helping to build that support and maintain it. And you do need that community support to be able to have a really strong and effective immigration program. So it's not just something that's nice to do. I'd say highlighting those stories and really making sure that we are giving the positive side of things is actually really critical. And just to touch on the previous discussion about professional qualifications, which again goes then into the international students and some of the issues that emerge there, when you find people who aren't able to use their professional skills, who aren't able to engage in the jobs that they'd like to engage with, or you have international students who find during a pandemic that they're left with no support, you then get a situation where people are really vulnerable. And that can lead to situations where they're forced to take whatever work they can find to try to get by, and that can then lead to situations of exploitation. So it's actually really important in our system that we think about the settings with a view to how do we guard against vulnerabilities emerging, how do we put safeguards in place to make sure that when people do arrive in this country, they're aware that basic human rights do apply to them, that it's not okay for them to be exploited in employment, and to actually know where to go to get support. Because one of the really interesting things, for example, that came through when we did the migrant fact sheet with the Cleaning Accountability Framework, which was released earlier this year, was that provision of basic information is so critical, ensuring that people know that when you're a migrant, basic human rights do apply to you. You have the same rights as other people in Australia. And knowing that there are supports and there are places you can go when you do need help, they're really simple things, but they make such a powerful difference to people who can quite easily find themselves in really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, even if you know the policy that exists and you should have the same rights, you still have to have a level of courage to be able to access it and and buck a system that feels like it might be working against you, right? Because the power dynamic for some of these people is it works against them, regardless of what policies and systems actually say. There is another question here in the app. Migrants often find barriers to employment related to lack of local experience. Is this just racism? How do we address this common barrier? Who would like to answer that question?
Migrant finds it.
Yeah, so you know, you're trying to apply for a job. Oh, you haven't worked in Australia. You're a migrant.
Yes.
No local experience, sorry.
Oh, but some people, some Australians who've travelled and worked overseas for decades, and when they try to come back and look for a job, that's also difficult for them as well, because you have not worked in the system. And I suppose it comes down to the network. And we are, you know, we're a bunch of social animals, human beings, and we do click, we form cliques, whether or not we're aware of that or whether or not we agree to that, but there are certain cliques, and who you work with, you're going to make sure that those people are actually same fit as you in terms of your organisation, workplace, etc. So therefore, if you have not been part of that clique, and that's the challenge, is that trying to take that risk and say, okay, they won't fit into the clique initially, but we'll take that risk and make sure that over the time, because of their skill set overseas, how can we utilise that perspective and that experience, and then if to grow our organisation, to grow our decision making, then we take that risk and bring that person in. It's just a mindset, really, for leaders in our institutions to take that risk in bringing somebody who's different into the organisation and making sure that they will fit in eventually and contribute.
I wonder, Violet,
very quickly, Ming.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go Ray.
I know we're focusing on migration at the moment, but you've actually raised a really important point that extends more broadly, because it's not just something experienced by migrants, but also, for example, young people who find that they're told, well, you don't have any experience, so until you get that, you can't work. People with a disability who often find those types of barriers when they try to engage in employment. So I think while we're looking at it today through the prism of migration, there's a much broader conversation to have about how do we get that diversity into employment to actually strengthen our workplaces and make sure that we are getting those different experiences and different skills and different perspectives brought in, because rather than seeing them as being a barrier, they should actually be seen as strengthening and enhancing the workplaces that we have.
Speaking as Chair of the Diversity Council, completely agree with you. But also from the perspective of, you know, as a, you know, sometimes we hire people and we just look at the professional skills, but half of who they are is also the values they migrate into an organisation. Do you want to address that quickly, Lorraine, in terms of, you know, the integration of I'm putting this in, but Australian values in inverted commas versus values that we're wanting to, you know, basically ensure that we're you know, employing in a company. And then I'll come to you, Violet, because I know you wanted to answer that too. So Lorraine, can I start with you first on that particular question around values?
Just in a nutshell, the values you've described are Australian values. I mean, we pride ourselves on being a nation of a fair go and egalitarian, and where everybody can make a contribution. So to my mind, those issues of diversity and inclusion are core Australian values. We just need to focus on actually putting them into effect in a much more significant way.
Yeah, Violet, you want to talk about that? Because we tend to focus a lot on just the skills. But, you know, I know as you know, being a director on a number of boards, values and culture is increasingly an important feature of what we're looking for in individuals in companies. Do we focus too much on that skill set and not enough on those values that you know, Lorraine's saying, these are Australian values?
I think the whole issue of workforce for all Australia is a critical issue, and all employers, large corporates and small and medium enterprises, are really taxed on this issue. And we have great policies like diversity inclusion, as we know, the great work of DCA around this, Diversity Council. However, what we want to see on the ground is how do you bring that to life? And I know that as an organisation, we're approached by employers all the time. So there is many employers who are actually very interested in actually employing refugees, humanitarians and migrants. However, they just don't know how to go about it. And many is because they feel diversity is going to really enhance. They think it's a really good thing for their organisation. But also they believe in this resilience and stories of refugees and the way in which they've arrived. They believe there is something there that really would be of benefit and value to the ethos and the culture of their business and their organisation. So there's a lot of positivity. It's just about how do they actually make that happen? Because, you know, it does take time and resources. A good example for our society is we've had a long-term relationship, and I think this is really the answer that you actually need to look at as a corporate or small business, looking at a long-term approach to this, where you build relationship and you look at providing opportunities in your organisation where people can come in at entry level and all different levels of the organisation. That's what we've done with Allianz. We started up a scholarship, and they also started an Allianz Ladder, which was for young refugees and humanitarian entrants, teaching them pre-employment training, workshops around foundational business skills, leadership, and then they all get a chance at one job. Over the years, I think there's been 21 people employed, and many have stayed on average 2.6 years. So it shows there's some, and many have moved into senior roles. So it shows that once you engage and you commit, then you will get the benefit of it. But I think it is a whole approach.
Yep. I'm giving the
one
bill
thing
from
very
the...
quickly?
Sorry, Lorraine.
Just in one sentence very quickly, I think that's all really important. But we often talk about diversity as kind of a feel-good thing for business, that you do it because it's a positive, moral type of thing. I think what we really do need to focus on is it is that, but more importantly, it's an economic positive. It's actually good for business to do this. Yeah. So it's one of those really nice situations where what is morally a great thing to do actually perfectly aligns with what is economically a smart thing to do.
Yeah.
And just quickly, our brand's small business, and I tell you, you need to have to have the skill set as well as so it's trying to, while I thought about the culture fit, but then I also thought about the skills that's needed for the business as well. So I think you need to have one doesn't outweigh another, but actually have to have that equal balance of skills, attitude, contribution, perspectives, definitely. But to get that right is more difficult than it's easier said than done.
Yep. Now I've just been given the gotta wind up, but I have to ask you one question, so you have to keep it short. What is the number one change you would nominate to make the migration system more human-friendly and navigable for migrants? Start with you, Di.
Oh, gosh.
One. Only allowed one.
One?
Yes, one.
One what?
One change you would make to the migration system to make it more human-friendly.
Well, I think the three levels have to talk to one another, as well as the business community and the whole community. You have to bring everybody to the table.
Ecosystem, get rid of silos. Got it. Lorraine.
Absolutely that, but also it needs to be quicker. We need to actually do things in a timely way so that people have certainty.
Okay, fast. Violet.
I think introduce clear, fair and timely pathways to permanent residency for temporary residents in particular. That allows for people to grow roots and live good lives here.
Yeah, so get rid of the ambiguity. Thank you very much to all of you for your contribution today, because I think it's quite important for us to have that understanding of the different experiences that migrants have in this country. And I really do want to thank CEDA for putting on this migration conference, because I want to make sure we have, and I would always talk about this, we move from what I tend to find sometimes in migration is a G-rated conversation to an MA plus conversation, especially when racism exists and we put walls around ourselves so that we don't step into that, and we don't want to step into that space, so then we sacrifice respectful, diverse and courageous conversations for an area that is so fundamental to our country. So thank you for the CEDA team for putting this in place, and certainly encourage you today to have those courageous conversations, to really understand the human experience of migrants to this country so that we can make a real impact and make sure that it changes for the better. So we are now moving to a conversation around evolving the system, that session, now that we've given you all the asks that we would like. But thank you very much for Di for coming in today, and for Lorraine and Violet being on virtual for us today as well.
We are changing gears and keeping the information and content and insights flowing for all of you. I hope you sort of feel free to sort of stand up and jump around a little bit just while I introduce our next speaker. Can I just say two things, Di? Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. And I just love someone who just speaks straight, speaks the truth, and really appreciated you being here and bringing your insights to the conversation. And more power to you, please. I also have to do just one more thing. I was just amazed. I'd forgotten that Lorraine was going to be on our panel session, and I hadn't joined the dots. I was on a panel session with Lorraine yesterday, talking about responsible AI, and at that time it was 5 o'clock in the morning in Geneva. And so, in a full day, Lorraine's talked about responsible AI at 5 o'clock in the morning. She's done a day job talking about torture, and now she's bookended it tonight to talk about migration. And I just need to put a plug in for what a hard-working woman she is. And I didn't want people not to realise that. So we are racing through this. Our next guest is really uniquely placed to kind of bring a different perspective. We've heard from some Canadians around their ambition, but Lance Kaplan is the co-chair-elect and partner at Fragment in the US. He arrived in Australia just earlier this week, and I think is going to really give us some insights around how the system is seen from the outside, because we've certainly heard some perspectives from the inside. So Lance, please join me on stage. You go that side, so my mic's line up. So perhaps the best way to sort of, well, firstly, I should say thank you to Fragment for all of your support, and thank you for being here and travelling across to Australia to be part of the conversation, amongst other things. But we've got about 15 minutes, and then we're going to bring a panel up here to have a broader conversation. But Martin Parkinson, leading this migration review, kind of painted a bit of a picture of our system being broken and very complex and all the rest of it. We like to beat up on ourselves a bit. What's your perspective on where we are and compared to the rest of the world?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's very good to be here on behalf of the firm, and certainly to be able to participate in what is a really important discussion. Martin's discussion was really interesting for me personally, and there are two opening points I just would want to make as an observation about the Australian system. First of all, this is an area where I have personal experience. I have lived in Australia. I was born in South Africa, spent at least 6 of my formative years in Australia, and then obviously have been living in the US for many years. So I've had actual personal experience with the Australian system, and I obviously also am fortunate enough to be able to get access to and be able to view other countries' systems. And the first point I would like to make is it's important to pat yourselves on the back for the fact that you're actually going through this review, right? That you cannot underestimate the importance of a country being willing to undertake this review, take a step back, analyze what's working, and actually be honest enough to make some changes. So I think that that's a very important issue. And I think that goes to the issue of the requisite perception of Australia in the market, in the industry generally. And Australia is deemed to be one of the more reliable, one of the more trustworthy locations to which people can move, right? And there are two things which create this level of, let's just call it certainty. Number one, the system has integrity. You'll be amazed at the impact that the perception of integrity has on an organisation who wants to move people into Australia, and into a particular market, and or create a level of foreign direct investment into a particular country. That plays a huge part because it does give the investing entity a lot of certainty. The second issue, which I think is important, is that you do, while there isn't, there was a comment made earlier about, there are changes which occur all the time in Australia. To give you some comparative, in the US, right, getting any immigration change through the system is impossible. And I could spend another 4 hours discussing why it's impossible, but fundamentally it's very difficult to get change into the system. So what you do have going for you, and I think it's very important, is that you're willing to have the discussion. And in that construct, let me just make some suggestions, because we only have 15 minutes. The first thing I think that is very important in terms of getting the system to be more competitive for the correct talent. There is some low-hanging fruit which I think you must address, which is the notion of the intercompany transfer. I know it's a very important topic. I know it's been discussed extensively, but it's fundamental to a core immigration system, and it deals with the issue of an ability to keep an organization moving. And at the end of the day, what businesses need is they need that ability to keep their business moving, to keep their business growing. And the fact of the matter is that transferring skill from one organization where there is institutional knowledge to another organization will accelerate, the local entity's ability to grow and grow in connection with the overall business plan of the broader worldwide firm. So I think that that's a really important point, and it was so encouraging to hear that Martin says we want feedback, and there's a huge amount of feedback that we could genuinely give them in that regard, but that's one very important item which I think is critical. And I'm going to run through a few of them. Obviously, each of them are a debate in and of themselves. The second point I would like to stress relates to definitely be very, very, and this goes to the point about, saying it like it is. Be very real about your skills assessment, I think. There's a lot of discussion about skills assessment and who we think the country needs and what benefit. But the concept of skill really should, to the extent at all, if at all possible, try and be somewhat depoliticized, in the sense that skill is not only STEM graduates in terms of creating progress for the country. Skill could be the next layer down of, you can call it slightly lesser skilled individuals. And the point about it is that if you begin to populate at a lesser skilled level, it does give you an ability to fully populate your workforce, which in turn allows you to then grow your senior skills. Don't underestimate the issue of the pipeline that you can actually get for more senior skills from lesser skill. And that could span multi-industry sectors. It could span the resourcing sector, it could span hospitality, it could span any one of a number of industry groups which rely on and use various levels of skill. And the reality is that there is a skill shortage, albeit that, on a worldwide level, we are all, regardless of whether we look at it from the perspective of Australia or the US or certainly the UK and Europe, and even Canada, as was mentioned, everybody's very concerned about it, the impact of inflation, rising interest rates, and a potential slowdown. Notwithstanding all of that, what we see at client level is every client still, even those that are contemplating potential layoffs, still have a great concern about getting the right skill into the right job in the right amount of time. So that leads me to my third point, which is the concept of, there's been a lot of discussion this morning around improving the administrative process, right? And the reality is that there is no getting away from the impact of digitization. And in reality, there is a huge opportunity to correlate your skill requirements and the ongoing analysis of what skills do we need today versus what skills are we going to need tomorrow, and utilize the concept of digitization to keep that approach moving. And if you digitize appropriately and your skill analysis to a degree provides you with an opportunity to understand who is within the system and who are the possible opportunities to put in the system, you then will be able to sort of adjudicate in a much more effective and efficient way. And that adjudication will create the opportunity for Australia to get an even better reputation than you've already got, because there's a direct correlation between the need, the assessment of the need, the adjudication, and that too will have implications for the local communities understanding that, yes, those people are coming in, but they really are beneficial to the organisation, and you'll get less resistance to them coming in because there's a fundamental basis for making that underlying assessment in relation to them coming in. And that's a really big commitment, obviously, at government level. Digitisation, there isn't one organisation that we're working with at our firm that isn't self-reflective around what more can we do, including our own, by the way, what more can we do at our organisation to digitise, and what's the point of digitisation? The point of digitisation is going to be, we need to be able to understand and predict what we need in order to run our business. And if you think of Australia as a business enterprise, if you keep it at its basic level, you need to know what skills you need to be successful. So there isn't that much of a correlation right now on a what I would call a fluid basis that gives you an ability to make those decisions as quickly as you really need to. And that's where the system seems to stall, because there are certain artificial decisions which then tend to be made without the benefit of that, what I would call much more real-time analysis of skill. So those are just a couple of items, and I just want one more if I could. In the previous panel, there was a discussion about the notion of how do we really capitalize on an individual's education and or form a skill base. And for years, one of the opportunities that's existed, and I think Australia, you have an opportunity to lead in certain areas in terms of the global migration discussion. I think this could be one of them, and that is that think boldly about taking the lead around creating transparency in the area of credentials assessment, right? Yes, it's highly, if you look at it, and again, to speak candidly, probably quite a political issue. In other words, the Mechanical Engineers Association wants to keep control of who they think is a mechanical engineer, right? Push the limit, in my opinion, on that issue. I think if you are able to accelerate that component of, let's just call it endorsement and or certification and or recognition of those skills, what will happen is it'll give you an ability to look around you at other countries, right? So when you look very briefly at a country like Canada, they're going to compete for those same engineers and STEM graduates that Australia is going to compete with. Then say, for example, if you look at the US, and if you say to me, where is the biggest opportunity for Australian talent? It actually is in the US immigration system. Why? Because the US immigration system is extraordinarily slow, it's incredibly bureaucratic, albeit it's making some noise towards getting digitized. It's made very little progress towards digitization. So as a result, an organization that would otherwise send 1,000 people into the US, and we do have clients that can send, over 1,000 people into the US, and then they confront the H-1B situation where you've got, 65,000 cases. And, they literally call it a lottery, and you may or may not get an H1. And if you get an H1, you've then got to wait until October in the next fiscal year to actually get it approved. I know there's been a previous discussion about this particular situation in Australia a few years back, but one cannot underestimate the importance and the value of being an alternate place to park those H-1B potential candidates, maximize the opportunity. Let's assume you're a multinational organization with a healthy presence in the Australian market. Bring them here. It gives you an opportunity to expose them to because Australia is an extraordinary place. It's a destination that many of these highly skilled people want to go to. And I can tell you that a large portion of those people who otherwise are on their way to the US will not want to go to the US. They will want to stay. They will want to settle. And you'll have a much greater ability to begin to change the mind of the organization to say, okay, look, I can achieve as much as I can achieve in Australia as we potentially could in the US. Yes, the US is an enormous market. The economy is massive. The opportunity for scale is extensive. But Australia, you can get them to Australia. They'll be welcomed in Australia. You have exchange rate opportunities in terms of cost, cost comparisons. So don't underestimate the importance of what I would call the deficiencies in many other countries. So I think those are the sort of few points I just wanted to make. I know we have a very limited amount of time.
No, that's fine. And I know my team is going to be jumping up and down as I do this, but I do have one more question.
Sure.
But we'll have to be quick.
Okay.
So a lot of richness in that answer, and I think the issue around digitisation has come up. I think the thread that I would draw through there is back to where you started, which was the integrity of the system. And so I think one of the things that I would sort of just draw out a little bit is that you're sort of emphasising that using digitisation to bring data to decision making will support the reasoning for bringing those particular skills in those numbers, which should then help to increase the integrity of the system from the perception of people within Australia, which I think is really important. And I could go chapter and verse on a bunch of other digitisation stuff, but I won't. I did want to ask you this question because it comes up a lot. Obviously, I come from Melbourne, so I'm still really traumatised by the pandemic. But, we closed the borders. There was the sense that the way that was communicated, the suddenness of it, and the complete absence of much movement in and out has sort of blemished us and our reputation internationally, and is going to deter people from coming here. Is that the case?
Yes, I think Australia did suffer as a result of that. And I think it's, having said that, I think it was deemed to be overly restrictive and sort of very unbusiness friendly, right?
And is that sense still there? Have we got a legacy issue now that we need to lean into?
I think it's still there, but I certainly think that you have an opportunity right now because people are in what I would call, they would like to be in what we say a post-pandemic environment, and people have said, okay, that's enough. Let's move forward. So I think it's not going to be difficult for you to put that in the rearview mirror, to look forward and take the lead. And I just want to leave you with one last point. Don't be afraid to take the lead in global discussions around migration. I think Australia's got enormous credibility as a thought leader in international migration issues. And I think, using just one example as, if you want to sort of take the lead in the construct of talking about digitization, take the lead in the construct of the situation of transparency around qualifications. and engage potentially with either a pilot, maybe between you and the UK or you and Canada and the UK. Let's try and decide, okay, the 3 or 4 industry associations should really come together and say, if you approve ours, we're going to approve yours. And you have an opportunity to punch above your weight, in my opinion, in this particular issue, and you should seize the moment. And I think that will cause people to look at Australia as, oh my gosh, that they are like enormously forward-thinking, and the pandemic issues will be way behind you.
Well, we've raced through those issues. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining me on stage. If you could join me in thanking Lance. I'm going to ask you to go that way.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I'm inviting to the stage my next group of panellists, Chris Spence-Zaris, who's a partner at Fragaman, Charlotte Stevenson, who is the International Mobility Lead Australasia from Arup, and Julie Williams, who is the National President and Fellow at the Migration Institute of Australia. And I was hoping people were going to bring chairs up so we didn't have to play some sort of game of musical chairs. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to try to channel Ming. Ming's sort of closing with the, one thing or two things, if I can do that, just to start the conversation, with a question to each of you. Live stream audience, please jump onto Pigeonhole. We will get to questions there. And for the audience in the room, turns out we do have microphones. So if you are feeling like you're wanting a bit of sort of face-to-face engagement, once I've asked the first question, if you feel like asking a question, just make yourself known to the CEDA team in the room, and they'll bring a mic over, and we can let you ask a question as well. Now, to the people on the stage, this is my question for your sort of hot button one answer. What is the real pressure point in the migration system at the moment? What would you sort of highlight, Julie?
Efficiency. Lack of efficiency. And yes, we need to break through that, and that's the frustration where Lance was saying that we have an opportunity to be a leader in this space, but what's deterring everybody is the efficiency and just transparency of how long processing is taking for not only businesses but also individuals.
Chris?
I'll say complexity. It is overly complex, it isn't transparent, it isn't predictable, and that's something we need to deal with.
And for me, I think it would be flexibility or lack of flexibility. We need to be able to have more choice to determine what we need, as opposed to being told prescriptive, these are the occupations and these are the tasks that you must adhere to, and these are the qualifications that are required.
So, efficiency, complexity, and flexibility. And they're all intertwined, I sort of feel like, because and actually not necessarily mutually compatible, perhaps, because greater flexibility might not get you the simplicity and the predictability that you need, which I think sort of highlights one of the challenges that Martin's review team is going to front into, actually. Julie, we do have a complicated system. We've got regional work visas, we've got a whole bunch of different streams. What would you highlight as being the sort of important reforms to try to improve on that?
Absolutely. Regional is definitely key to our success. They rolled out what we thought was going to be this fantastic new visa scheme for regional Australia, and it really hasn't lived up to its expectations. There's a lot more restrictions. For example, there's the employer-sponsored regional visa, the 494. There's also regional occupation lists on subclass 482. And a 482, you can go anywhere within Australia. And the 494 was supposed to be there to assist regional employers, but also to encourage more migrants into those regional areas. And it hasn't done that because it's more complex. As Chris was saying, we need to lose the complexity of it all because there's a skills assessment that's required, which also Lance was referring to earlier. Everybody that is applying under the regional skilled migration has to have a skills assessment, whereas the 482 don't, and that limits a lot of people being able to access that visa pathway. Also, the English language too can be it doesn't make sense to have the same level of English language for a tradesperson as there would be a senior executive. And I think that's also limiting access to a lot of people too, where they might be already working, employed, but they're not able to break through that barrier. So there's a lot that can be done with regional skilled migration. The government made an announcement that they want to be able to assist all those that, or thank all those that were here during the pandemic on the short-term skilled visa occupation list for the 482. To transition them through to permanent residency where they didn't have a pathway before. However, anyone in a skilled occupation on the regional occupation list is not given that same opportunity, yet regional Australia are crying out to be able to keep these skills, and there's no pathway for them to permanent residency. So that's disappointing, and that needs to be addressed.
I'm going to jump straight onto one of the questions that's come through on Pigeonhole from Mark Glasbrook, which is a sort of broader question around this, which is how does Australia address the challenge faced in regional and low population growth jurisdictions in terms of getting better migration outcomes? And let me sort of add to that, and perhaps it's a bit anecdotal and you can refute this or give me the evidence otherwise, but I find myself when I'm travelling to regional locations, including in Tasmania, where you have conversations with people who have moved to those locations because it's easier for them. Mm-hmm. They have skills that are not being used because those jobs weren't available in that region. They're doing other jobs, which means that their skills are deteriorating or not being utilised on a daily basis. And then the intention is that they're going to end up back in a capital city anyway, which just seems like an incredibly disruptive and human capital wasting process, if I could put it that way. Is that a sort of, a frequent sort of occurrence, and how do we get to a better outcome?
Yes, no, it's definitely there. We see accountants working as cooks and not using, and graduates of Australian universities and not being able to utilise their skill set to the advantage. And again, going out to regional areas thinking it might be easier to access their pathway to permanent residency. And then it goes into, I guess, the settlement program where they're not encouraging and keeping people there in those regional areas because, as you do say, they go back to the metropolitan areas. There needs to be a lot done, I think, with not just getting a visa, but also looking at the whole settlement package and making people feel that they are embraced and welcomed in that region, but also making them feel that they're not remote. So there's other areas of government that need to get involved there to make certain that they've got all the facilities that we have here in metropolitan areas.
So reiterating the point that we heard in the earlier session about all three levels of government working together and investing in those services, the social services, the infrastructure, and thinking about what the genuine job opportunities. Opportunities are.
Exactly.
Charlotte, one of the points that Lance was making was, and it comes back to this sort of matching point, if you like, or skills matching, is that it's difficult to predict what jobs and skills are needed, that we need to do a better job of that. How might the skilled migration system be improved from that perspective, based on your experience?
I think what we struggle with is there is a predetermined expectation on what an individual's skills and experience should be based on the occupation lists that are set out. But what we see in the engineering sector particularly, and for Arup particularly, is that we are focused on creating a sustainable world, and everything that we do is around sustainable buildings and sustainable transport systems, and the skills don't exist necessarily, or certainly not in abundance in Australia, that are critical to enable us to continue to do that. And the occupation lists haven't evolved to the point of capturing the importance of climate and sustainability and all the very niche skills, whether it's design or infrastructure or implementation. They don't exist within that occupation code. So we're trying to, we have a mismatch already with the skills that we need and the ability within the visa program to match it up. So you get creative, you kind of have to just try and navigate the system to get the right individuals in. Then also, like internally, we're having to look at how do we get creative at looking at other skills that people have which are transferable and can be adapted and agile to move into different roles. We have to think differently around how we recruit, whether domestically or internationally, to meet the needs of our clients and for our own business. And looking at early careers and knowing that individuals don't necessarily go to university anymore and for a variety of different reasons. So having a prerequisite for a specific qualification doesn't necessarily go with how we want to source individuals within the market. And then also that we want people to be agile in their ability to adapt and change, to pick up different skills or move from one particular industry to another industry, one skill to another skill set, and we want to encourage that, but it's not necessarily how our visa program or our migration program is created.
So it's such an interesting issue, and if you think you've talked about some of the big transitions that we're going through, and if in any conversation at the moment, if you're talking about energy transition, sustainability, digitisation, technology, for me, the overriding sort of message that we get is just the scale, the absolute scale and magnitude of the sorts of investments that we have to make. And then sitting alongside of that is the conversations with businesses who are saying, actually the number one factor that's influencing our investment decisions at the moment is, can we get the skills we need? So do we need, are we making this too hard for ourselves and trying to be too prescriptive and too narrowly focused? And do we just need to maybe embrace a bit more of the Canadian philosophy that we heard this morning, which is actually we just need to bring in a lot of people with broadly these sets of skills and expertise, and it might not be for a job with you forever, but they are going to be skills that someone somewhere in Australia is definitely going to need in the next decade, and maybe we just need to embrace a bit more of that.
Absolutely. I think as an accredited sponsor, which we're very fortunate to be, I feel as if we should have some autonomy to make decisions around the people that we need for our business and for the broader industry within Australia, and just be enabled and empowered to say, this person has a certain set of skills, we need them in our business, and they may well go to another organisation. That's fine, that's how people operate nowadays. We don't necessarily want someone to come and have 25 years with us, although that's great as well, but it's not a prerequisite for coming in and being with us. So yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to come back and ask you another question about business and skills, but I'm going to bring Chris into the conversation because one of the things that we hear a lot about, and it maybe is consistent with that conversation we were just having, but is the importance of the pathway to permanency. How how important are you seeing that? And so in one sense, you know, we're talking about these big transitions in climate, energy, technology, where, you know, it's just sort of opening the doors a bit and saying, please come, stay if you like, don't stay if you like, you know, whatever. But would it be important for us to say, please come, and by the way, there's a path to permanency? How are you seeing?
I think it's extremely important. Individuals are making decisions to come either short term or long term, and if it's long term, they're bringing their family along, and they need certainty that they can get permanent residency. With the current process, I guess, with migration lists changing, it could impact their pathway to permanent residence. So it doesn't give them certainty that they'll have a pathway, a guaranteed pathway, I should say. So we need to look at that. And then it's also important for those that are in Australia, their pathway to permanent residency, if they're on a short TSS visa, they are currently locked in to their employer for a 3-year term, unable to, if they want to not reset their time spent in the position, they are unable to move and therefore have career progression. So they stay in the same role with the same employer for 3 years, and that certainly is an impact on them individually in terms of their career progression, but it's also Australia, because they're not, we're binding them to one company unnecessarily, I would think. And where the 3 years comes from, I don't know. Why shouldn't it be 2 years? Why shouldn't it be 1 year? But certainly that's something I think we've got an opportunity to revisit and look at.
I've got a question which I think sort of segues nicely from that too, because I think the pathway to permanency and the way we brought skilled migrants in has been a kind of key feature of the Australian system one way or another. International students is also something that I think people sort of associate with Australia, and the fact that we've at various times, I think, been considered a leader in this space, and at other times perhaps less so. I've got a question from the audience around how can the migration program change to incentivise international students who've got their qualifications here, and are we in the right place with that? I'm happy to sort of open that to everyone actually to bring a different perspective to that, but maybe Chris, start with you.
I think we're not taking advantage of the fact that we've got young graduates that have completed an Australian qualification at university, and then we don't want to incentivise them to stay in Australia, work, and give them a pathway to remain here permanently. So at the moment they qualify, they'll get a 4885, a graduate visa, allowed to work here for up to 18 months, yet a TSS visa requires 2 years of work experience in the occupation to qualify to remain for further 2 years, 4 years, and then pathway to permanent residency. So certainly from an international graduate, I guess, mobility perspective, there's an opportunity to hold on to those graduates that could positively, no doubt, contribute to our communities and business.
It seems to be a wasted resource, really, and a lot of them don't always just come and do tertiary education. They might have started earlier in secondary schooling. They've been here for a long time, and as Chris said, they get an 18-month visa. Why? There seems to be such a misfit when you require 2 years, yet you're only allowed 18 months. It's just a wasted resource, and we need to be looking at that. I understand that, and it'll be a good question to follow up with the Minister this afternoon, that they are looking at extending the 485 to be a longer pathway, but it's not for all. It's only at the moment for tertiary qualifications at university level, not looking at trades, and that's where they need to also look at trades. We've got a big shortage on trades, and there is really no pathway for them to be able to get that experience and remain here. But it is a waste to have them qualified and then let them go.
And presumably having spent time in the community as well, and sort
That's
of
right.
finding their feet. Charlotte, what about you in terms of, I previously sat on the board of a company that was very focused in trying to attract international student talent. What role does that sort of stream and the potential of it sort of represent for an organisation like yours?
Yeah, I think we absolutely have to be able to hire students into for the engineering industry in general. I don't want to be selfish and take everyone, but engineering in itself is just in very short supply. So how do we encourage students to look into engineering in the first instance, and then offer them the ability to have a role with some permanency within Australia? And going to the discussion that we were just having around students and then graduates, we need to enable them to have the long-term stay in Australia, make Australia their home, their base, but also allow them then to take a break outside of Australia, because often they finish their qualifications, they want a break, they may want to go and experience other things, they may want to go to their origin home for a period of time, and that in itself then creates an issue with being able to return to Australia and to make Australia its home. So I think there's a big focus there around enabling students to have a life in the longer term in Australia, but not be afraid to leave and come and go and do the things that they need to do as well to have life experience.
I've got two questions here which I'm going to bundle together and give to you as well, Charlotte, because I think they make sense together. So the two questions, one of them is around how we can utilise older workers in Australia to fill the skills needs while the migration system is getting back on track. And related to that, there's a question about the impact of the cost of sponsoring a skilled person and the role of migration, if you like, in filling skill shortages. But sorry for being a bit long-winded here, but I think there is a really interesting question and a conversation going on in Australia at the moment around full employment versus migration. We haven't had the migration that we would normally have. It ended overnight, and we've got this incredible sort of skills shortage now. I guess people were interested in understanding, what does that feel like for you? What are the different levers that you're pulling at the moment to be able to sort of get the skills that you need? Is it a case of, it's always going to be a case of domestic plus, but how are you thinking about that, and how is that framing your thinking about the long-term sort of structure for the migration system? Big question, I know, I'm sorry.
That's all good. I think for us, we're having to think very differently as to how we source skills. So I think I mentioned around it doesn't have to be traditional engineering background. We are looking at what are the core skills or even behaviours that we look for in an individual in order to enable them to adapt and be agile, and we can then grow and foster that capability into something else that we need within the organisation. So it is taking it away from engineering and looking more at core sets of skills and focused at that level, and helping individuals see how engineering is evolving and changing and the value that it can bring to the world. Also, I think there's a whole need for us to be flexible in delivering different ways of working, so it doesn't have to be that 5 days a week doing this job for the foreseeable future. We can look at job sharing, part-time work. There's a lot of people who want to find that balance between having a corporate role, but also following their dreams, which could be something entirely different. And how do we find that balance and allow that balance to happen from a migration perspective? But just when we are sourcing talent, we generally, of course, look domestically first and foremost, but then we will look internationally, and that tends to be for individuals who are already well established in their careers. And you always, when you talk to the business around, we may need to look outside of Australia for these particular skills. There is a bit of you can see the shoulders slump and the eyes roll a little bit around the journey we're about to embark on associated with that, which means that you're likely, we could be 3, 4, 5 months out before actually having someone coming in, and that in itself is a challenge. We want to encourage our businesses to look outside at alternative skills and experience and creating diverse thinking as well. So we don't want to keep recreating what we have at the moment. We have to think differently, hire differently, get different skills.
So Chris, that's a nice hand pass to you too, because I know one of the things you wanted to talk about is the way the immigration system might better accommodate some of the post-pandemic lessons or trends, if you like, including new ways of working. I mean, my sense is that the current system wouldn't accommodate that type of working arrangement, because you've got to dot the I's and cross the T's in terms of hours worked and credentials and this, that and the next thing.
It doesn't accommodate at all, whether it's immigration regulation or policy. It doesn't deal with it. You need to effectively work full-time hours. Otherwise, you'll be in breach of your visa conditions. It's as blunt as that. So now with employers moving towards more flexible working arrangements, 4-day weeks, job sharing, there needs to be, I think, thought given to how that we might accommodate that in immigration policy and be more flexible. But there's no allowance currently for it. In addition, I think one key with this flexibility consideration is at the moment business needs, or has for a long time needed, a better way to deal with short-term travellers or skilled workers. We've got the 400 visa that permits up to 6 months' work for non-ongoing projects. But projects go for longer than 6 months. And we would say, again, to Lance's point earlier about a dedicated intra-company transfer visa, something that permits up to 12 months of work in Australia, flying in and out, because it's not 12 months in one period, would certainly assist business.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we can focus on new ways of working and post-pandemic, but I think the point about the intercompany transfers too is that we do need to make sure the system reflects the way that organisations are increasingly managing their workforces, and the way you think about the opportunities created to work on different projects. And one of the things that I've, Jared will roll his eyes when I say this, but years and years and years ago, when you sort of studied development economics, there was this really great sort of argument around migration was so good because it supported the transfer of skills and knowledge. And we don't seem to talk about that you know, that people coming in, even on an intercompany transfer for a period of time, can play a really positive role in lifting the skills and capabilities of the people and the teams and the organisations that they work with, not least by transferring their knowledge around working in culturally diverse places and all the rest of it. And it's interesting that it just doesn't seem to be something that we want to acknowledge as an advanced economy, that this is still a really important driver of human capital uplift. I think it would be good if the conversation reflected that.
It goes to also, unfortunately, we're so restrictive where you come on one project to work on one particular project, you're not allowed to move to another project, even though you've still got time on your visa, because it will be a breach of your visa conditions. You were approved to work on that project on another one. So again, from a compliance perspective, we need to look at being more flexible to permit that upskilling.
Yeah, and I think for highly skilled workers, maybe not so much of an issue, but, as was referenced in one of the earlier conversations as well, when you tie visa holders to particular employers, you set yourself up for a slightly less healthy dynamic as well in terms of the sort of power base between the employer and the employee and some of those unintended consequences.
That's true.
Julie, I'm going to bring you in for this question. I'm going to link a question that I had already, but also one that's in Pigeonhole, which is, the Immigration Minister has said previously that some elements of our visa system hinge on what passport you hold. I think we all know that to be true. The conversation with Meng was all around, the benefits of greater diversity in the migration intake and in the talent pools that we're sort of trying to tap into. How is the system placed at the moment, do you think, in that respect? And what are we missing out on? What are we missing out by actually being a bit prescriptive around what passport you hold?
Okay, well, I don't... Generally across the employer-sponsored, I don't think there is that tendency to determine on what passport you hold. It used to be perhaps where you were, no matter what the passport was, perhaps what country you'd have to go through, for example, a health check, medical examinations when it had no relationship with the occupation you were working in. They've just recently done away with that. So they're starting to strip away some of those things that perhaps wasn't necessarily a passport, but what country you're coming from that restricted or delayed visa processing. They've got, obviously there's different visa classes, specific like the Palm visa, Pacific visa, getting in workers for specific passport holders, and that is more, I guess, working with our neighbours, helping our neighbours as such. The working holiday visa, there's got quite a diverse range of countries now part of that, and a lot more countries have been included as recently as July this year. So, and that often stems with negotiations with that particular country. So I'm surprised in a way. I do think there is a diversity there, and I don't think there is restrictions depending on people's passports. It's more so if they're coming out on a visitor visa. And that's, I think, where it plays a bit more of a role. Student visas, yes, definitely. That can be a lot more difficult. They may have to go through a lot more rigorous checks if they do want to come here and study, which is a shame when we're trying to attract international students back to our shores again. And that's probably an area that needs to be looked at to provide a much more open playing field for everybody concerned.
Charlotte and Chris, I'm going to ask you a question that goes to a topic that comes up a lot when we talk about skilled migration in particular. Charlotte, you talked before about, when you're looking to fill positions and looking for skills needs, that first and foremost you look to the domestic market, not least because of the more cumbersome migration route. But one of the contentious issues, if you like, is around labour market testing, and
bane of our existence.
That got a response, didn't it? Let's talk about labour market testing. Like, is it rubbish? Yeah.
There's no business. There's no logical sense in it. It doesn't make business sense what they're asking.
Right.
I think it's probably, it might be necessary, but how you demonstrate that you've actually genuinely tested the market, that probably needs to be reconsidered. At the moment, an employer needs to advertise on 3 different platforms. The advert needs to be in for 28 days at least, and the advert needs to be very carefully have the position, duties, remuneration, all sorts. And if you get it wrong, time starts ticking again. You have to re-advertise for that position. So I think it is aligning the business's usual recruitment processes with the immigration process might make sense. So it might be that an employer, particular business, has a 14-day open window for their adverts, not 28 days. It might be that they, in that 14-day window, their policies is if they find the right candidate, they make the offer there and then. They don't keep it open for the full 14 days. It's the ways we can do it differently in terms of proving that or demonstrating that you've genuinely tested the local market.
So I think, let me sharpen this question up a little bit, because obviously this is, I mean, Martin set the scene for us at the beginning of the day. I mean, we know that there's the economic arguments and the social arguments, and trying to make sure that there is always social licence, and this labour market test kind of sits right in the middle of all that. And I think sometimes we sort of conflate this a little bit, and there's a lot of talk now about setting income levels, or being looking for simplicity in saying that there are two different categories, if you like, those that earn over a certain amount of money and those that earn below it. And I think, if we're getting to the heart of it, aren't we saying that the labour market testing issue is a lower wage issue, and how do we build confidence in the community that employers are not looking to undercut local wages and conditions, which is essentially the issue here. I mean, what is the solution there? Is it as simple as saying, here's the line in the sand, which I'm attracted to, but I also think, to Lance's comment in terms of talking about skills, we've seen through COVID that there are we've been relying on migration to fill a whole bunch of skills, some of which are higher skilled and higher paid, and others lesser paid, whether they should be more paid or not. So this is the nub of the issue, isn't it? And how do we build that confidence?
I think Chris hit a really valid point there. It needs to align with how business practices operate within this space, and it still possibly needs to be there. But in a lot of occasions, they've already advertised, and they've got to do it again. It's delaying the process, and also with the beginning of the pandemic, everyone thought, okay, this is going to, we're going to have too many people unemployed, but it was reverse. Yet they increased the requirement of how many ads were required, and they boosted it more so, and now it's become even more onerous. So I think there needs to be a lot more discussion with businesses and businesses across the sector, not just sort of big end of town, but the trades and that end as well, to discuss what's working for businesses, because it's definitely delaying the processing, and it's just cumbersome, and it's a lot of additional work that's not necessarily required because it's not aligned with business practice.
I think there's something maybe around the accreditation status, or something that looks like that, where you have a proven track record of investing in education, investing in building talent domestically, as well as doing what you need to keep your business running, and the skills that are required to keep your business running, whether that's from bringing skills internationally or domestically and growing them yourself. LMT is, it feels like it's an administrative burden, like you are going through the motions, but often it's not how we source candidates in the first instance. So we may have already determined that a person has a certain set of skills or experience that we need in our business. We weren't even looking for them. We didn't know we needed them until we came across this person. And networking just within the industry is another way where you hear about great people who do great things, and you want to bring them into your business. It's not, I don't know that we've ever successfully sourced someone through an active labour market testing process.
Yeah, I think again, there's so many themes coming through our conversations, because it's skills. I've always been struck too, and perhaps this is the higher skill level, it's also experience. It's the things they've seen. It's not just the PhD. It's the fact that they've worked on a project that went bump in the night, and they know what to do with that, or they've worked in a culturally diverse location, or very different sort of circumstances, and it's hard to write that on a piece of paper and say, well, if you did, you would look like you were being deliberately sort of cheeky with your labour market testing and, you know, must have worked for 6 months in Mozambique or whatever. We've got 1 minute. I'm going to channel a Ming here, and we're standing between the audience and lunch. So, we heard from Martin at the beginning of the day. He's outlined pretty bold ambition and a pretty tight time frame. Are you confident? The question that's been put in the Q&A is, do you think it's going to be another tick and flick, which is a negative way of framing it. So I'm going to flip it and say, how confident are you that this is going to produce the positive desired framework for the future migration system? I'll start with you, Chris.
I think it will. I think the timeline is ambitious. I think certainly this government has shown a willingness to really consult and listen and have some quick wins, but also more long-term look at structural reform that will benefit Australia. So I think I've got confidence it will make some meaningful change. There will be, but it's the timeline. I'm not convinced it would happen as quickly as what has been is expected.
I agree with the timeline. I unfortunately wasn't here to hear Martin this morning, but I was listening to Claire O'Neill, Minister for the Department of Home Affairs at the Industry Summit this morning, and she did say she was not one to sit around when things needed to be done, and liked efficiency and wanted to see things moving through. So I think she's leading the group and wanting to see change and wanting to see it happen as quickly as possible. I'm quite positive with this government that they can do it.
Charlotte?
Yeah, agreed. I think something fundamental has to change, and it has to change quickly. We certainly can't carry on the way that we are at the moment if we're really going to evolve and grow the talent within Australia and continue to grow businesses.
Well, that's a good call to everyone to sort of participate and engage. I can give you a question on notice for the Minister later today, which is going to be, can we aspire to a position that our Canadian speaker was alluding to, which is bipartisan or non-partisan complete support for an immigration system, which we seem to have not always landed in Australia. So I'll try to make sure the Minister responds to that question. Can you join me in thanking the panel? It is time for those in the room for lunch. You've been a very good audience in terms of sitting through an awful lot of information, all interesting and exciting, but probably time for a break. We're back at 1 o'clock for the final two sessions. So please enjoy the break, and we'll see you soon.